There are lives that remind us that silence is not emptiness, but a deeper language awaiting discovery. In the stillness between sound and light, the human spirit sometimes finds its truest form, and perhaps in that vast quiet lies a kind of seeing more profound than sight itself. Good evening, wherever you are listening, from a quiet room, a long journey home, or a gentle twilight beside your window. This is Biography Files Docs. Share with me, if you wish, where and when you are listening tonight as we continue weaving our global network of memory. And if you find solace in these stories, consider subscribing to join us again. It was June of 1880 in the small town of Tuscumbia, Alabama. The air was heavy with the scent of magnolias, and the hum of summer carried through the trees. In a white clapboard house shaded by oaks, a child was born who would never truly know the sound of those trees rustling or the light glinting between their branches. Her name was Helen Adams Keller. Her father, Arthur Keller, was a veteran of the Confederate Army and the editor of a local newspaper. Her mother, Kate Adams Keller, was younger, patient, and full of the soft hope that settles over young mothers when the world still feels manageable. In those first months, Helen was like any other child, lively, curious, responding to the warmth of her mother's embrace and the rhythm of familiar voices. But as the seasons turned and the child approached her second year, illness came. The exact nature of it remains uncertain. Some doctors later speculated it was scarlet fever, others meningitis. What is certain is that it came like a sudden storm and left behind a terrible stillness. The fever broke, the child lived, but her world was gone. The sounds faded first, then the light. Imagine, if you can, a child waking into darkness and silence at once. The world becomes texture, vibration, breath, and motion. What does time feel like when there is no dawn or dusk to measure it? What is fear when it has no sound? For Helen, life after illness became a strange rhythm of confusion. Her family watched her hands grope the air for patterns she could no longer sense. She would touch the mouths of others, trying to understand what they were doing when they moved their lips. She made gestures of her own, private, instinctive signs, but they were not enough. The gulf between her and the world widened. Frustration grew. Sometimes she screamed, striking out in blind rage. Other times she would sit quietly, tracing familiar paths through the garden, her fingers moving through petals and leaves as if searching for the lost shape of sound. Her mother, Kate, refused to give up. She read of a young woman named Laura Bridgman, another deaf and blind girl who had been taught to communicate decades earlier at the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston. If Laura had found her way to the world, perhaps Helen could too. Letters were written, inquiries made, and eventually a response came from the director of the institute. He would send someone, a young teacher, barely 20 years old, with eyes that had once failed her too, but had been restored through grit and learning. Meanwhile, Helen's days unfolded in near silence. She had grown wild in her frustration, clever in her own way but untamed. Her father's patience wavered, her mother's hope sustained them both. Yet even in her anger there was brilliance, a desperate intelligence seeking connection. Her sense of touch had become almost supernatural. She could identify people by the vibration of their footsteps, distinguish moods by the rhythm of breathing, and even sense a storm approaching through the pressure in the air. Still, knowledge without language is a dream without form. Her mind was awake but locked. The household lived in anxious anticipation for the teacher from Boston. The day she was to arrive, the morning sun fell across the veranda, and the air carried that peculiar calm before something irreversible happens. At the gate, a horse-drawn carriage stopped. From it stepped a young woman dressed in dark wool, her hair tied neatly, a traveling bag in hand. Her name was Anne Mansfield Sullivan. She had come not only to teach, but to save, to guide a mind caught between worlds back to meaning. No one in the Keller household, not even Helen, could yet understand how fateful that meeting would be. Kate Keller waited on the porch, holding her breath. Inside, Helen roamed restlessly, her small hands moving through empty air, unaware that the person who would change everything had just set foot on their soil. Anne stood for a moment at the threshold, feeling the southern heat pressing against her skin. She had known poverty, orphanhood, and partial blindness. The scars of her own hardship had not hardened her. They had tempered her into something steady, unyielding. As she crossed the doorway, the house seemed to shift slightly, as though time itself paused to watch. There are moments in history that seem too quiet to mark themselves with fanfare, yet they alter the shape of human understanding forever. This was one of them, the meeting of two souls who shared no common language, no common sound, only an unspoken faith that somewhere within touch lay the key to everything. Later, Helen would write that before Anne came, she lived at sea in a dense fog. The metaphor was not of despair, but of distance, of drifting without bearings. And that morning, a single knock on the wooden gate was the first faint echo of rescue. The door creaked open. A child waited inside. The teacher stepped forward. The sound of that first step would never be heard, yet its echo would travel through a century. The knock upon the gate lingered in the air long after it was answered, like a pulse suspended between two worlds. Anne Sullivan's first sight of Helen was not of a helpless child, but of an untamed presence, bright, restless, fierce. The girl moved through the room with instinct more than awareness, touching the furniture, tracing shapes in the air, her movements sharp and unguarded. When Anne tried to greet her, Helen reached out, her small hands grasping with intensity, exploring the stranger's face, her hair, her dress. For the first time, another presence did not recoil. It was as though two storms had met and recognized something in one another. Confusion answering to compassion, will meeting will. Anne's first lesson began not in words, but in resistance. Helen had grown accustomed to ruling her small kingdom through touch and tantrum, manipulating her household through emotion rather than communication. She had learned that silence could command attention and rage could draw response. But Anne was different. When Helen's temper flared, Anne stood firm. When the child kicked or struck, the teacher calmly but firmly held her ground. It was not cruelty. It was the establishment of a boundary, a truth, that to be understood, one must also listen, even in silence. They moved into a small cottage on the family property, away from the indulgence of family affection. There, teacher and pupil faced each other alone. The days that followed were a battle of wills disguised as lessons. Anne brought with her a set of simple tools, a manual alphabet used to spell words through patterns of touch on the palm. She began with basic objects: doll, cake, water. Helen mimicked the hand motions at first without comprehension. To her, they were only patterns, meaningless vibrations of movement. She could not yet grasp that each motion represented a concept, a name, a doorway into a new world. Anne's persistence was legendary. She wrote later in her letters how she repeated each word dozens of times, shaping Helen's hand, pressing meaning through skin and patience. But nothing seemed to penetrate. Helen grew frustrated, angry at the constant intrusion into her silence. She threw objects, slammed her fists, resisted the touch that was trying to open her mind. Yet Anne did not retreat. She saw, beneath the defiance, a mind aching for order, a consciousness aware that something immense existed beyond her grasp. One afternoon, after yet another failed lesson, Anne took Helen to the water pump in the yard. The sun lay warm across the garden, and the air trembled with the low hum of insects. Anne placed one of Helen's hands under the running stream while spelling the word water into her other palm, slowly, deliberately, again and again. The liquid gushed cool over Helen's fingers, spilling and splashing as if alive, and then something happened, something invisible but seismic. The connection formed. The pattern of motion suddenly aligned with the rushing sensation. Helen froze. The water poured over her hand and she felt the pulse of life in it, the unnameable clarity that what she touched could be known, called, remembered. She turned to Anne, demanding more, spelling the word frantically, eagerly, as if fearing it would vanish if she stopped. In that instant, the world unfolded. Everything Helen touched had a name: pump, earth, tree, teacher. She ran from object to object, her hands trembling with discovery. Each word was an awakening, each touch a revelation. The fog that had surrounded her began to thin, and the light, though unseen, found its way into her mind. Anne followed, tears streaming silently, understanding that she was witnessing the birth of consciousness made visible. That night, Helen slept soundly for the first time in her remembered life. Anne wrote that she lay still, one hand curled against her cheek, the other resting open as though holding something fragile and precious. In truth, she held everything: language, knowledge, connection. She would later write that that day her soul was born. But the miracle was not only in the child. Anne's life, too, changed in that moment. She had been a girl who fought her way out of the shadows of poverty and partial blindness, who had known the cruelty of institutions and the loneliness of being unseen. In Helen, she found both her purpose and her reflection. Theirs was not a relationship of teacher and pupil alone. It was a merging of destinies. The days that followed were filled with the fever of discovery. Helen demanded new words, new ideas. She pressed Anne's hand impatiently when she felt her teacher move too slowly. The once destructive energy that had terrified her family transformed into boundless curiosity. The rhythm of her fingers became music in motion, silent yet resounding with thought. The household watched in awe. The miracle was not divine but human, born of discipline, courage, and the refusal to surrender to despair. Anne knew, however, that this awakening carried a new challenge. Helen's hunger for knowledge was insatiable, but knowledge without structure can easily become chaos. So Anne began to introduce abstract concepts: love, think, sad. These were not things Helen could touch, yet somehow she grasped them. She understood love first through feeling Anne's heartbeat, through the warmth of her presence and the firmness of her guidance. When she asked what love was, Anne replied by pressing her hand to her own heart. Helen wrote later that she could feel the answer more than understand it. The bond between them deepened into something wordless, yet enduring. It was said that Helen's hand rarely left Anne's. She followed her everywhere, as if the thread of connection between them must never be broken. Through that thread, she learned to navigate not only space but meaning, to read the world through the shape of another's patience. In the quiet evenings when lessons ended and the air filled with the soft songs of crickets, Anne would sit by the lamplight, writing letters to the director of Perkins Institute, recording Helen's progress. Her handwriting carried both exhaustion and joy, the fatigue of constant effort mingled with awe. She confessed that she often felt she was teaching a soul how to breathe. Helen, in turn, began to sense the unseen world expanding beyond her reach. She felt the vibration of laughter when people spoke nearby, the tremor of footsteps that told her who approached. The barriers between her and life were not falling all at once, but they were cracking, letting light seep through in patterns of touch and rhythm. And yet at night, when all was still, she would sometimes wake and feel the vastness of the dark pressing close, reminding her how easily that fragile bridge could disappear. In those moments, she would reach out for Anne's hand and, finding it, return to calm. Trust had become her first true word, though she could not spell it. The pump still stood in the yard, the water still spilling over the stone, whispering the same secret it had told her that day, that meaning lives in movement, that even what cannot be seen or heard can be known if one dares to feel deeply enough. The teacher slept, the child dreamed, and the silence around them was no longer empty. It was full, alive, waiting. And in that silence the water continued to flow, carrying with it the first glimmers of a voice not made of sound, but of touch, memory, and light. The water at the pump still murmured through Helen's dreams, whispering something she could not yet name but already knew. It was not only that she had learned words, it was that the very notion of meaning had entered her life like the slow spread of dawn. In the days after the revelation, she moved through the house as if seeing for the first time, though her eyes could not perceive light. Her fingers traced everything: door frames, spoons, curtains, the warm muzzle of the family dog, and with each touch she spelled its name into the air as if baptizing the world anew. The people around her, once shadows in her uncomprehending existence, became real. The objects she had thrown in frustration became symbols, things with names, and through names, a connection to the vast fabric of human experience. Anne Sullivan watched all this quietly, recording every gesture, every moment of recognition. She had been trained to teach, but this was something beyond method or pedagogy. It was as though she were guiding a mind across the thin threshold between chaos and order. Each day, Helen's vocabulary grew: bread, milk, teacher, earth. Soon she began to ask questions, first simple, then profound. She would touch an object and ask not only its name, but its reason. Why became the new rhythm of her thought. There was astonishment in that word, but also a kind of grief. For with knowledge came awareness of absence. She began to sense the vastness of the world she could not see or hear, and though she felt it through others, she would never experience it as they did. Anne saw that sadness in her sometimes, the quiet withdrawal after moments of triumph, the stillness of a child who suddenly realizes that every window opens onto distance. To learn, Helen used every sense she possessed. Her fingers followed the movement of lips when Anne spoke, so she could feel the vibration of words. She learned to read embossed print by touch, sliding her hands along raised letters, memorizing their forms until the meaning flowed effortlessly. It was as if her entire body had become an organ of perception, skin transformed into ear, muscle into eye. The world entered her not through sight or sound, but through contact, texture, rhythm. When she felt the warmth of sunlight on her face, she called it warm. When a breeze brushed her cheek, she knew it was wind. She was building a map of existence from fragments, yet somehow her understanding seemed more whole than most people's. Anne noticed that her pupil did not merely memorize words. She absorbed them, let them breathe within her. One day, as they walked in the garden, Helen touched a rose and spelled its name, then paused and signed the word love. She asked Anne if the two were the same. Anne took her hand and spelled back slowly, "Love is something like the fragrance that stays in your hand after the flower is gone." Helen stood still for a long moment, and though her eyes saw nothing, her face tilted upward as if she were watching something rise into the sky. From that moment, abstract thought began to bloom. They moved beyond things one could touch into the invisible realms of feeling and memory. Helen began to write simple sentences, tracing letters into wax tablets, guided by Anne's steady hand. She described her dog, her mother, her teacher, and the garden she knew by scent and shape. Each word was a victory, a bridge across silence. Anne corrected her gently, but she also knew that the child's imagination was expanding faster than grammar could contain it. Sometimes Helen would invent words of her own, private combinations of signs that carried meanings only she and Anne understood. It was not rebellion, it was creativity, a living language growing out of touch. News of her progress began to spread beyond Tuscumbia. Neighbors whispered of the miracle child, though to Anne it was not miracle, but the patient work of two wills refusing to surrender. Visitors came, curious to witness what they could not comprehend. They watched as Helen moved her fingers in graceful patterns, her expression alive with comprehension, her joy palpable. Yet what they saw was only the surface. Beneath that surface lay countless hours of frustration, of tears neither could voice, of exhaustion that came from building a world out of nothing but patience and faith. Helen began to sense that her experience was unlike anyone else's. She could feel the curiosity of the visitors, the way their hands trembled slightly when they touched hers. She sensed pity in them too, and that pity confused her. In her world, she did not feel lesser or incomplete. She felt alive in ways they could not imagine. When she felt their hands hesitate, she would press her palm firmly into theirs, as if to say, "Do not be afraid of my darkness. It holds its own light." At night, when the household slept, Anne would sit beside her pupil and let her fingers rest in hers. They spoke without words, conversing through tiny motions, half-conscious movements that carried more meaning than speech. In those hours, teacher and student were equal. Two souls adrift in the same silence, sharing the same fragile miracle of understanding. Anne often wondered if perhaps Helen's mind was a glimpse of what humanity might be if freed from the distractions of sound and sight. Pure consciousness, stripped of illusion. As the months passed, Helen's command of language grew so rapidly that it astonished everyone around her. She began writing letters to friends and relatives, her sentences filled with affection and wonder. She wrote of her garden, of her lessons, of her joy at discovering the names of things. "I am not dumb now," she signed once, with a trembling smile. But even as she celebrated her growing freedom, Anne could see that language had also awakened a new kind of solitude, the solitude of thought. To think is to be alone in one's own mind, and now that Helen could think, she had entered that solitude. One evening, as twilight deepened around them, Anne guided Helen's hand to the window pane. Rain was falling, and the cool drops left patterns against the glass. Helen traced them with her fingers, then turned and spelled, "Is this what a song feels like?" Anne paused, struck by the beauty of the question. How could she answer? Perhaps it was. Perhaps music, to Helen, was the vibration of rain against the skin, the pulse of life reminding her that the world still reached for her even in silence. In time, the lessons expanded beyond words into history, geography, mathematics. Helen learned quickly, impatiently. Each new fact filled her with wonder and unease. She asked about the stars, about the ocean, about death. When Anne described the sky, Helen signed that she wished she could touch it. The teacher replied, "Perhaps you already do every time the wind brushes your hand." Helen smiled and pressed her fingers to her face as though holding the invisible. Through language, she had been reborn, but with rebirth came the weight of awareness. She understood now what she lacked, and that understanding sometimes brought tears. Yet those tears were not of despair, but of awe, the kind that comes when the boundaries of the self begin to dissolve into something vast. And so, night after night, the house in Tuscumbia filled with the soundless music of discovery, the rhythmic tapping of hands in the dim lamplight, the patient repetition of letters carved into air, the faint rustle of pages as Helen traced their lines. Outside, the water pump stood silent, its handle glistening with dew, but in Helen's dreams, it still gushed endlessly. the stream of water spelling the first word she had ever truly known. That soundless flow would never cease. It had become her heartbeat, her way of speaking to the world. The seasons in Alabama moved softly, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile harmony that had taken root in the Keller household. Spring stretched across the garden, and Helen walked among the flowers with her hands extended, tracing the contours of life around her. Every leaf, every petal, every grain of earth spoke to her in the language she had begun to understand. A dialogue of texture, of warmth and vibration. She could feel the slow pulse of sap through branches, the delicate tremor of an ant crossing her palm. In these quiet exchanges, she met the world not as a spectator, but as a participant, her fingertips the bridge between inner silence and outer abundance. Anne followed close behind, describing through patient spelling the things Helen touched, the color of a rose, the height of the trees, the distant curve of the hills. But Helen often responded with a curious certainty, as though she already knew. "I feel the sun," she once signed, "and I know it is round." Her teacher smiled, recognizing that knowledge, for Helen, did not depend on vision. She did not need to see light to understand its shape. She felt it pressing against her skin, steady and eternal, like the gentle hand of an unseen friend. In those early years of discovery, the natural world became Helen's true classroom. The air, the soil, the breeze, they were her textbooks. She learned that the world could be read by its breath. When rain approached, she sensed the change in air pressure before anyone else. When a bird flew nearby, she felt the faint flutter against the space it disturbed. The earth itself became her language, and every motion within it a syllable. She wrote later that she never felt alone in nature, for it was always speaking to her, even when she could not answer. Anne encouraged this communion. She understood that the more Helen felt the world, the more she would comprehend it. Together, they spent long hours in the garden or by the small stream that cut through the Keller land. There, Helen would sit with her feet in the water, feeling the current slide between her toes, learning the difference between stillness and flow. She felt the pebbles beneath her feet shift as the water passed over them, and said that it reminded her of thoughts moving through her mind, constant, invisible, shaping everything they touched. Anne never corrected her metaphors. She simply recorded them, knowing that Helen's way of understanding was poetry without words, but learning through touch had its own shadows. Sometimes the world felt too vast, too ungraspable. Helen's fingers could reach only so far, her body only so much. There were nights when she lay awake, tracing the air above her, yearning for the unreachable. Once she asked Anne if everyone saw the same sky. When Anne spelled yes, Helen grew quiet. Her face turned toward the window where moonlight glowed faintly through the curtains she could not perceive. She signed, "Then we share something, even if I cannot see it." In that moment, she discovered the essence of belonging, that it is not the eye that unites us, but the act of wonder. Her education continued with discipline and devotion. Anne read to her through tactile sign, spelling entire books into her hand. Helen absorbed stories of heroes and philosophers, of nations and revolutions. She was fascinated by the idea that people fought and dreamed for causes they could not touch, for ideas invisible and vast, yet she also sensed the fragility of those pursuits. "Why?" she once asked. "Do people destroy what they love?" It was a question Anne could not easily answer, for it contained more wisdom than instruction could provide. In the evenings, the two of them walked beneath the trees. Helen could not see the starlight filtering through the branches, but she could feel the night's coolness on her skin, the whisper of leaves moving overhead. She said that it felt like being inside a great cathedral, the wind serving as its choir. These walks became rituals of reflection. Anne speaking slowly, Helen listening with her hands, their steps in quiet rhythm across the darkened ground. Visitors continued to arrive, their curiosity mingled with disbelief. They watched as Helen navigated her surroundings with uncanny precision, as she laughed at jokes signed into her palm or recited passages from memory. To them, it was a spectacle. A child robbed of two senses, yet living with more awareness than most could fathom. But to Anne, it was not spectacle. It was the slow unfolding of human potential, the living proof that the mind's reach is not limited by the body's confines. She guarded Helen fiercely against the gawking eyes, ensuring that curiosity never became exploitation. In this, she was both protector and gatekeeper, shaping the child's growing fame with caution and humility. As Helen's understanding deepened, so did her empathy. She began to sense not only the textures of objects, but the moods of people. She could tell when Anne was tired, when her mother was anxious, when her father's silence carried unease. "I feel it in their hands," she explained once, "like weather changing." It was a kind of emotional perception that no sight or hearing could replicate, an intimacy of spirit formed through touch and attention. Her teacher marveled at it, wondering if perhaps blindness had stripped away illusion and left behind only essence. But there were also moments of frustration, of exhaustion, of the heavy fatigue that follows unrelenting effort. Anne often collapsed after long days of teaching, her eyes aching from strain, her patience stretched thin. Yet even in weariness, she never let Helen see despair. She knew that her strength was the foundation upon which Helen's faith rested. In her private letters, she confessed that she sometimes feared failing her pupil, that her own blindness, though partly healed, haunted her still. And yet she pressed on, believing that in teaching Helen, she was healing something within herself. By the time Helen reached her 8th year, her progress had surpassed anything the family had imagined. She could communicate with clarity, read simple texts in Braille, and compose letters that carried both tenderness and insight. Her thoughts were full of imagery drawn from touch, hands like rivers, silence like wings, warmth like memory. She described her teacher not as a guide, but as light itself. "Before she came," Helen would later write, "I was without light or thought or joy. But in her, I found everything." Yet even in this harmony, an undercurrent of uncertainty lingered. Helen was growing beyond the limits of her small world, and Anne knew she could not remain confined to the garden forever. There were schools, libraries, and entire worlds of knowledge waiting for her beyond Tuscumbia. The thought both thrilled and terrified them. How would the world treat a child who could not hear or see, yet demanded to be understood? One afternoon, as they stood once more by the water pump, Helen asked if the water that flowed through her hand ever ended. Anne replied that it joined a river, then a lake, and eventually the sea. Helen stood silently for a long while, then signed, "Then everything that moves becomes part of something greater." It was a statement more than a question, and it hung in the air like a prayer. The water continued its endless rhythm, rising and falling, whispering truths too deep for words. That night, as the moon rose unseen, the two of them sat by the window. The world outside was vast and unknowable, yet Helen felt it near, pulsing with life. She pressed her hand against the glass and smiled. Somewhere beyond that window lay the promise of a wider world, waiting for her touch. By the time Helen reached her 10th year, her world had grown as vast as her imagination could hold. Yet the deeper she ventured into understanding, the more she yearned to give voice to it, to release the thoughts that crowded her mind into sound, to make them live in the air as they lived in her hands. For though her fingers could shape words and her teacher could interpret them, there was a lingering desire for something more ancient, more instinctive: speech. To speak was to be heard, to leave a trace of self beyond touch, and that longing stirred in her like an ache. Anne Sullivan sensed it before Helen could even articulate it. She saw the way the girl's hand sometimes hovered near her own mouth as she spoke, how she felt the vibrations of sound against the air. Helen did not yet know what words sounded like, but she could feel their presence, their energy, and in that invisible trembling, she imagined a music that belonged to the living. The first steps toward speech were arduous, almost cruel in their demands. There was no reference, no model for Helen to imitate directly, only vibration and memory. A speech teacher named Sarah Fuller took her hands and placed them on her face, letting Helen feel the subtle movements of lips, tongue, and throat. For each letter, each sound, there was a unique vibration, a secret choreography of muscles and air. Helen began to mimic these shapes, forming them with effort and devotion, not knowing how they sounded, but trusting the sensations they produced. Her teacher would correct her patiently, guiding her toward a rhythm she could never hear but could feel. The first time she managed to produce a sound that could be understood, even faintly, her entire body trembled. The sound was rough, broken, unfamiliar to the ear, but to Helen it was the purest form of liberation she had ever known. She felt the vibration in her chest and realized that she could command the same invisible forces that others did when they spoke. That night she lay awake, her hand resting over her throat, feeling the quiet pulse of life moving through her like an echo of something divine. Yet the path toward fluent speech was fraught with disappointment. Her words, though understood by those who knew her, remained strained, distorted. Strangers could not make sense of them, and Helen's elation often turned to frustration. She longed for her speech to carry beauty, to mirror the grace she felt inside, but the sounds betrayed her. Once, after struggling to pronounce a sentence, she signed to Anne, "The words break when they leave me." Anne replied softly, "All words break, Helen. The meaning stays." But Helen wept that night, feeling that her voice, her truest bridge to others, was still locked away. Anne reminded her that expression was not confined to sound. She placed Helen's hand over her heart and then over her own, showing her that emotion spoke even in silence. They began to read poetry together, Helen tracing the raised letters in Braille, while Anne spelled the rhythms into her palm. The verses of Shelley, Tennyson, and Longfellow opened new worlds of emotion. Helen felt their cadence through touch, their imagery through imagination. "Poetry," she once signed, "is the sound of the heart thinking." And though she could not hear the melodies of the lines, she understood their pulse. Her writing began to take shape during this time, not as imitation but as necessity. With a Braille stylus and a board, she began to record her experiences, her reflections, her small revelations. Her early sentences were simple. "The wind is my friend. The flowers tell me secrets." But as her mind grew, so did her prose, expanding into intricate meditations on life and meaning. Writing became her truest form of speech, a silent conversation with the unseen world. Each word she carved onto the page was an act of defiance against isolation, a declaration that her mind was as vivid and articulate as any other's. Anne watched her pupil with awe and pride, but also with quiet worry. She knew the world beyond their home would not always understand Helen's difference. There were people who would pity her, and others who would doubt her intellect, unable to imagine thought existing without sound or sight. Yet Helen's determination was unstoppable. She insisted on learning not only to speak, but to understand others through lip reading by touch. She placed her fingers against the mouths of speakers, feeling the delicate shapes their lips formed. In time, she could follow conversations this way, catching the rhythm of laughter, the tremor of emotion hidden in speech. To her, language was no longer confined to any one sense. It had become a living presence that moved through skin and air alike. But speech was not only a tool for communication, It was a mirror for the soul. As Helen's command of language deepened, so did her introspection. She began to question not only how to express herself, but what expression truly meant. Was speech the only form of being heard, or could silence, too, carry its own eloquence? She often sat by the garden, her fingers resting on the grass, feeling the movement of the wind, and wondered whether the earth itself was speaking in ways no human language could capture. Her teacher once found her like that and asked what she was thinking. Helen signed, "I think the world says everything, but we do not always feel it." It was during this period that she first began to compose longer essays, pieces filled with insight that seemed far beyond her years. She wrote about light, though she had never seen it, about sound, though she had never heard it. To her, these were not absences, but forms of mystery. "I know light because I feel its warmth," she wrote, "and I know sound because I feel its motion." She refused to define herself by what she lacked. Instead, she redefined what it meant to perceive, to live, to be. As she continued to study speech, her efforts took on a spiritual quality. The act of forming sound became, for her, a prayer, a reaching beyond herself towards something infinite. She came to believe that all expression, whether through voice or hand or thought, was a form of communion with the larger world, and in that belief she found peace. She no longer sought perfection in speech, only sincerity. "If I speak with truth," she told Anne, "perhaps someone will understand, even if the words are broken." Sullivan, her teacher, moved by the purity of that thought, realized that Helen's journey was no longer about instruction. It was about revelation. Through her students' struggle for expression, Anne herself began to see the world differently. She had once thought of teaching as giving, but now she understood it as sharing, as learning anew through the eyes, or rather through the hands, of another soul. And so the two of them continued day after day, their lessons unfolding like prayer beads in time. Speech, writing, touch, all became one continuous language, bound not by sound but by faith in human understanding. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, Helen would sometimes rest her hand over her throat and feel the faint vibration there. It no longer troubled her. The sound, imperfect as it was, had become a symbol of connection, of courage, of the fragile yet indestructible bridge between silence and speech. Outside, the night spread softly over Tuscumbia. The crickets sang unseen songs in the grass, and though Helen could not hear them, she felt their rhythm in the air. It was enough. The world was speaking, and she, in her way, was answering. The path that led Helen Keller from her quiet Alabama garden to the lecture halls of higher learning was not paved with privilege or ease, but with the steady rhythm of patience and will. The world had begun to take notice of the girl who could neither see nor hear, yet spoke through her hands with eloquence and depth. Newspapers wrote about her, ministers preached of her as a symbol of divine perseverance, and curious visitors arrived in carriages from distant towns to witness what they called a miracle. But for Helen, fame meant little. What she sought was not admiration, but knowledge. Knowledge, to her, was a form of light, one that could be felt, understood, and shared even in darkness. Anne Sullivan, who had now become more than teacher, companion, interpreter, almost an extension of Helen's being, knew that her students' hunger could not be satisfied by simple lessons at home. The time had come to take her beyond the garden walls, into the structured world of institutions and books. The decision filled Anne with both pride and apprehension. The academic world, rigid and skeptical, might not easily welcome a student who could not hear a word of lecture or see a line of text. Yet Helen's determination was a current that could not be resisted. When she set her mind to something, it was as if the whole universe leaned in her direction. Their first stop was the Perkins Institute in Boston, where Anne herself had once studied. The city overwhelmed Helen at first. The vibrations of wheels on cobblestone, the rush of people, the pulse of unseen movement, all reached her through the soles of her feet and the air on her skin. To her, the world was alive in ways that sighted people seemed blind to. At Perkins, she was introduced to new methods of reading and writing, to formal Braille, and to other students who shared her world of silence. Yet even among them, she was different, not because of pride, but because of her restless intellect. She did not merely want to learn what others had discovered. She wanted to ask why things were so, to reach the roots of thought. Her teachers were astonished at how quickly she absorbed abstract concepts, mathematics, geography, history. Each subject opened to her, as if she were rediscovering something she had known in another form. She read about ancient civilizations, their rise and fall, and would sign questions to Anne about the nature of time, about why people built monuments only for them to crumble. Anne often struggled to answer, for Helen's questions were rarely about facts, they were about meaning. The girl's curiosity had already begun to turn toward philosophy, toward the invisible forces that guided human life. The bond between teacher and pupil deepened even further in these years. In crowded classrooms, Anne served as Helen's voice and ears, spelling every word of a lesson into her hand, interpreting her responses, guiding her through a world that existed only in vibration and touch. The effort was immense. Each day left them both exhausted, but neither complained. In the evenings, they would sit together in silence, Helen's hand resting in Anne's, the day's lessons passing between them without words. They no longer needed speech to understand one another. Their communication had become a kind of breathing. At Perkins, Helen first began to realize that her story carried weight beyond herself. Letters arrived from strangers, people who were ill, lonely, forgotten, telling her that her courage had given them hope. Helen would ask Anne to read the letters aloud into her hand, and she would answer them thoughtfully, her replies filled with empathy. She began to sense that her learning was not only for her own sake, but for others, that perhaps the knowledge she gained could someday serve as a bridge between worlds that rarely touched. But even as she thrived, Helen encountered skepticism. There were whispers that her progress was exaggerated, that perhaps Anne was guiding her too much, that the miracle was a clever illusion. Such doubts wounded both teacher and pupil, though they rarely spoke of them. In private, Anne wept over the injustice of it, the refusal of others to believe in the quiet labor of the human soul. Helen, upon learning of these doubts, did not grow bitter. She only signed, "They do not know what truth feels like." To her, truth was not proven by sight or sound. It was lived through experience, and experience was something no outsider could steal from her. As the years passed, Helen's ambition grew larger than the Institute. She wanted to enter a university, to stand among the great minds of her generation, not as an object of sympathy, but as a thinker in her own right. It was an audacious dream, but Anne, though aware of the monumental challenge, did not dissuade her. Together they set their sights on Radcliffe College, the women's branch of Harvard University. The entrance exams alone would have discouraged most. Helen had to read every question in Braille, compose her answers on a typewriter, and rely entirely on Anne's interpretation of material. It was a grueling process, yet she passed with distinction. The letter of acceptance arrived one crisp autumn morning, and when Anne spelled the words into her hand, Helen smiled quietly and said, "The world is open." At Radcliffe, Helen faced a new kind of trial. The campus bustled with life, debates, lectures, the chatter of students, and though she could feel the vibrations of their energy, she could not join their noise. Anne attended every class with her, fingers flying tirelessly to translate each lecture, each discussion. Together they turned spoken thought into tactile rhythm. Some professors admired them. Others found their presence disruptive, unable to comprehend how a woman who could not hear or see could grasp the intricacies of philosophy or literature. But Helen's intellect silenced most skeptics. She read Plato, Milton, and Kant through raised print and absorbed them with an intensity that startled her peers. Her classmates, at first distant, gradually began to approach her. They learned to communicate through the manual alphabet, discovering that beneath the quiet exterior was a mind alight with curiosity, humor, and compassion. Helen would write essays that left readers astonished by their insight. She'd never heard the sound of laughter, yet she could describe joy with precision. She had never seen the dawn, yet her words painted it vividly. She was, in every sense, proof that imagination can surpass perception. Yet the burden on Anne grew heavier. The constant translation, the relentless strain of interpreting lectures and guiding Helen through academic life began to wear on her health. Her eyes, always fragile, grew weaker, her nerves frayed by fatigue. But she would never admit it. When Helen sensed her exhaustion and begged her to rest, Anne would only smile and spell, "I can rest later." There was a quiet heroism in her endurance, a devotion that went beyond duty. To Anne, teaching Helen was not labor, it was life's purpose. In her final years at Radcliffe, Helen began to work on what would become her first book, The Story of My Life. Writing it, she said, was like walking through memory barefoot, each step tender, each recollection alive with scent and texture. The process forced her to confront not only her triumphs, but the shadows that had shaped her, the loneliness, the rage of childhood, the constant struggle to be understood. She wrote with a clarity that transcended pity. Her words were not appeals for sympathy, but affirmations of strength. "I am not afraid of storms," she wrote, "for I am learning how to sail my ship." When she graduated in 1904, the first deaf-blind person in history to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree, the world watched in awe. The ceremony was held under the June sun, and though Helen could not see the sea of faces before her or hear the applause that greeted her name, she felt the air tremble with warmth, with pride. She reached for Anne's hand and spelled a single word, "We." For she knew that every page she had read, every word she had written, every idea she had grasped, had been shared by the woman who stood beside her. That evening, as the day settled into twilight, Helen sat alone for a while beneath the trees outside the college gates. The breeze carried faint scents of lilac, the ground cool beneath her feet. She thought of the long road from the Alabama garden to this moment, the water pump, the patient hands, the endless lessons carved into her palm. She felt neither pride nor triumph, only gratitude. The night pressed softly around her, filled with the murmurs of a world she could not hear but deeply understood. Somewhere beyond, the stars glowed unseen, and she smiled, knowing that she was at last among them. When Helen Keller left Radcliffe College, she stepped into a world that regarded her with both reverence and bewilderment. To many, she was already more legend than woman, a symbol of perseverance, a story told in Sunday sermons and magazine features. Yet Helen herself felt the weight of that image pressing against her, confining her to the shape of a miracle, when all she wanted was to be understood as a mind among minds. She had no interest in the myth of the angelic invalid who conquered darkness. She wished to be seen as a thinker, a writer, and a seeker of truth. It was through words, those fragile marks upon paper, that she hoped to break free from the narrow reverence that threatened to silence her again, only now in a different way. Her first book, The Story of My Life, was born from that desire, though its making was as arduous as any of her earlier trials. Each page was composed slowly through the patient partnership between her mind and Anne Sullivan's guiding hands. Helen dictated through touch, and Anne, with the help of a young assistant named Polly Thompson, transcribed every line. The process was intimate, almost sacred. thought turned into motion, motion into ink. What emerged was not a tale of pity, but of illumination, a testimony to the vast landscapes that could exist within a single human spirit. She wrote not to boast of victory, but to reveal that blindness and deafness were not the boundaries of being, only conditions through which the soul must navigate. The book's publication in 1903 brought her a sudden, disorienting fame. Critics marveled at the eloquence of her prose, at the lyrical precision of her reflections. Some doubted that a woman who had never heard language could write so beautifully. Others dismissed her as merely a vessel for Anne's intellect. But for every skeptic, there were 100 readers who found in her pages something profound, a glimpse into the resilience of consciousness itself. Letters poured in from every corner of the world, from the blind, from the lonely, from those who had faced loss and found strength in her courage. Helen answered as many as she could, her hands aching from the effort, but her heart full. "To touch another soul through words," she once wrote, "is to hear across the silence." With her book, she had not only opened her world to others, but had opened herself to the world's complexity. Invitations arrived for lectures, interviews, appearances before societies and universities. Yet every encounter demanded translation. Words had to be spelled into her hand as swiftly as possible. Her responses transcribed in turn. The process was cumbersome, but it did not diminish her presence. People who met her often described an aura of calm intelligence, a quiet fire that seemed to emanate from her very stillness. When she touched a person's hand, they felt both her fragility and her strength, the paradox that defined her life. But the admiration that followed her success also carried a subtle danger. Helen was becoming a symbol, and symbols are easily claimed. Charities used her image to solicit funds, politicians cited her as proof of moral virtue, and preachers invoked her as evidence of divine will. Helen saw all of this with a kind of gentle unease. She did not resent the admiration, but she knew that being turned into an icon could erase the complexity of her being. "They praise me for rising above the darkness," she once told Anne, "but they do not see that the darkness is part of me. It taught me how to see." Anne understood. She, too, had begun to feel the burden of their shared fame. Everywhere they went, they were watched. Two women whose lives had fused into a single rhythm of devotion and discovery. Sometimes, in private moments, Anne confessed her fatigue, the deep ache behind her eyes, the weariness of constant travel and attention. Helen would take her hand and spell gently, "Then we will rest soon together." But rest never came easily. The demand for them grew relentless, and beneath the applause lingered the shadow of expectation that Helen would remain forever the miracle child, unchanging, pure, and endlessly inspiring. Yet within Helen something restless was stirring. The more she read and wrote, the more she became aware of the world beyond the polite admiration of society, the world of injustice, of poverty, of inequality. Her education had introduced her to philosophers and reformers who questioned the structures of power, and their words ignited a fire in her mind. The writings of Karl Marx, H.G. Wells, and the poet Swinburne awakened in her a sense that knowledge carried responsibility. To learn, she realized, was not merely to understand, but to act. "Knowledge without compassion," she would later write, "is a lamp unlit." During these years, Helen began corresponding with some of the great figures of her age. Mark Twain became both friend and admirer, drawn to her wit and her fierce intelligence. He affectionately called her the miracle child, though he knew she disliked the term, and once wrote that Helen's mind was as clear as sunlight through glass. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor who had long worked with the deaf, became another close friend, and through him, Helen began to glimpse the intertwined possibilities of science and empathy. Yet even in these illustrious circles, she remained humble. Fame to her was never a crown but a lens, a way to see more clearly the depths of human experience. It was around this time that she discovered her truest joy lay not in being celebrated, but in creating. Writing became the heartbeat of her days, her sanctuary against the noise of public life. She wrote essays on nature, on education, on the philosophy of sensation. Each piece revealed her unique perception of the world, not through sight or sound, but through an understanding of essence. "I know the rain," she once wrote, "not because I have seen it fall, but because I have felt it on my skin and known that it touches everything equally." Her writing was not descriptive in the ordinary sense. It was metaphysical, a vision from within the silence. Yet there were moments when she wondered if the world truly listened. She sensed that many admired her story without absorbing her message. They praised her courage but ignored the deeper challenge she posed, the challenge of empathy, of reimagining what it means to perceive. She began to suspect that her blindness was not the tragedy she had to overcome, but the mirror in which society could see its own blindness reflected. "The greatest tragedy," she would later write, "is not to be blind, but to have sight and no vision." As the years moved quietly forward, Helen's voice, though still strained in sound, grew stronger in influence. Through her pen, she began to shape public thought. The girl once trapped in silence was now a voice for millions, speaking across barriers that even the most eloquent orators could not cross. And yet every time she wrote, she still felt Anne's hand near hers, steadying her, as it had since that first day at the pump. Their partnership remained the invisible axis upon which all her achievements turned, but nothing lasts untouched by time. Anne's health, already fragile, began to falter more noticeably. The strain of years of teaching, interpreting, and travel had taken its toll. Some evenings, after Helen had finished dictating a letter or an article, she would feel Anne's hand tremble slightly as it withdrew. She would reach out, searching, and when her fingers found Anne's, she would hold them a little longer, unwilling to let go of the source of her light. For beneath all the praise and all the intellectual triumphs, Helen knew that every word she spoke was born from another's patience, another's love. And so, as her reputation spread and her influence grew, Helen carried within her not pride, but reverence. For words, for learning, for the fragile thread that bound her to others. She did not yet know that her ideas would soon lead her into controversy, that the world's embrace could turn cold when her thoughts challenged comfort. For now, she only felt the fire of creation, the joy of translating thought into form, the sacred labor of giving shape to truth. Outside her window, the world moved in currents of sound and light she could not sense. But inside her room there was a different radiance, the steady tapping of typewriter keys, the faint vibration of breath, and the unseen flame of a mind forever reaching toward what lies beyond sight. Fame had opened the world to Helen Keller, but it also revealed to her how narrow most human vision truly was. The applause that followed her lectures and books did not lull her into comfort. Rather, it stirred within her a deeper restlessness. She had touched the limits of personal triumph, and now her curiosity turned outward, toward the vast, complex body of humanity itself. She began to sense that her education, her writing, even her survival, carried a meaning beyond herself. The more she learned about the world through books, the more she felt its contradictions pressing against her, the beauty of progress and the cruelty it concealed, the abundance of civilization and the poverty shadowing it. The deeper her insight grew, the more she recognized that blindness was not limited to the eyes, nor deafness to the ears. Humanity, she thought, suffered from a greater kind of silence, the silence of compassion withheld, of truth unheard. Her expanding world brought her into contact with minds as restless as her own. Mark Twain, whose humor veiled a melancholy wisdom, delighted in her company. Their conversations, translated through Anne Sullivan's fingers, moved from laughter to philosophy. Twain admired her frankness and her lack of sentimentality. "People pity you," he once told her, "but you are the strongest of us all." Helen smiled and spelled into Anne's hand, "Perhaps strength grows when one must listen to the world without sound." Alexander Graham Bell also visited often, speaking of science and invention, of machines that might one day give voice to those without speech. Helen was fascinated by the idea that technology could serve as a bridge between solitude and community. She could not hear the hum of machinery or the click of telegraphs, but she understood the pulse of progress. Yet even among the great and learned, she felt a quiet unease. These men of letters and invention spoke often of improvement, of discovery, of civilization marching forward. But in the pages of newspapers that Anne spelled out to her, Helen sensed another truth, a world scarred by inequality, children working in factories, wars ignited by greed. She could not see these things, but she felt them deeply, as if the air itself carried their sorrow. She once wrote that, "The sense of injustice burns hotter in silence, for it has no sound to distract from its ache." Her empathy, sharpened by her own isolation, stretched far beyond the boundaries of her personal struggle. She began to see her disability not as a private burden, but as a doorway into the universal human condition. In the first decade of the 20th century, the modern world was taking shape. Telephones ringing across cities, railways knitting continents together, voices traveling through wires, and women beginning to demand a place in the chorus of history. Helen wanted to be part of this movement, not as a symbol, but as a participant. She began studying politics, reading essays on social reform, and delving into the philosophies that questioned the moral order of her age. She devoured the works of H.G. Wells, whose visions of the future fascinated her, and John Ruskin, whose writings on labor and art stirred her sense of justice. "I cannot see the poor," she told Anne once, "but I can feel their chains." Her growing awareness led her into friendships that would shape her next decades. She met leaders of reform movements, suffragists, and labor organizers. Many were surprised by the intensity of her convictions. They expected from her the serene spirituality of a saint, but instead found a mind aflame with inquiry and critique. When she spoke, or rather when Anne interpreted her signs, her words carried a quiet, relentless force. She spoke of education not as privilege but as right, of charity not as pity but as justice. Those who had admired her for her courage now found themselves confronted by her clarity. Anne Sullivan stood beside her always, her presence as constant as breath, but she too felt the shifting current in Helen's spirit. The child she had once guided through the alphabet of the world was now stepping into the labyrinth of ideas, questioning not only how to live, but why society was built the way it was. Anne sometimes worried that this path would bring Helen into conflict with the comfortable admiration she enjoyed. Yet she also knew that Helen could not remain silent once she had felt truth's weight. To silence her now would be to undo everything they had worked for. Their days were filled with lectures and correspondence, travel and study. Helen's letters became longer, more urgent, filled with reflections on the human condition. "I feel," she wrote to a friend, "that to be blind to injustice is the only true darkness." Her words were calm, never bitter, but they carried a gravity that demanded attention. When she met industrialists or politicians who praised her perseverance, she would respond with questions that unsettled them. "If blindness is a misfortune," she once asked through Anne's translation, "what name shall we give to indifference?" The partnership between Helen and Anne was evolving, too. They were no longer merely teacher and student, but companions navigating a shared moral awakening. Their bond, forged in childhood, had matured into an unspoken understanding. They lived in near constant proximity, working, reading, eating, traveling together, bound by the same rhythm of purpose. Yet beneath that harmony lay exhaustion. Anne's eyesight, which had always been fragile, grew dimmer, and her nerves, frayed by years of labor, began to fail her. But she would not rest. She believed that Helen's mission had only begun, and that to step back now would be to betray both of their callings. Helen, sensing her decline, tried to shield her from further strain, but Anne's pride was unyielding. She had given her life to this work and saw no other way to live. Together, they continued to move through circles of influence, meeting presidents, artists, scientists. In every encounter, Helen listened through her hand, felt through her skin, and spoke through the measured rhythm of Anne's translation. The world marveled at her composure, at the serenity with which she carried her difference. But within her mind, a quiet fire was growing. She began to understand that to live fully was not simply to learn or to teach, but to question the very shape of the world one inhabits. And the more she questioned, the more she found herself drawn to those who suffered unseen. There were moments when she longed for the simplicity of the garden at Tuscumbia, the scent of wet soil, the gentle flow of the stream. The world she had entered was louder, harsher, filled with contradictions. Fame had given her access to power, but also surrounded her with barriers invisible and cold. People wanted her inspiration, but not her opinion. They wanted her story, not her challenge. Yet Helen's vision, though born in darkness, was expanding beyond the limits of expectation. She saw what others refused to see, that the truest form of blindness was moral, and that the world, for all its noise and brilliance, was stumbling through shadow. As the years passed, her voice on paper grew stronger, her thoughts more daring. She began to write essays that questioned not only the treatment of the disabled, but the entire structure of society that allowed suffering to persist. She called for education that freed rather than consoled, for compassion that acted rather than pitied. Some praised her courage, others recoiled from her defiance. But Helen had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She had entered the realm of conscience, where comfort must yield to truth. At night, after long days of writing and correspondence, she would sit by an open window. The air would move softly against her skin, carrying the pulse of a world she could not see but deeply felt. She would think of Anne resting in the next room, of the journey that had carried them from that first touch of water to this vast, unseen horizon of ideas. She no longer longed to see the stars. She could feel them, each one a vibration of light in the boundless dark. And somewhere between those invisible lights, she sensed the shape of her next destiny forming. The deeper Helen Keller journeyed into the public world, the more she saw that progress often spoke in a language of light, but built its foundations in shadow. The factories that hummed with invention also throbbed with human exhaustion. The cities that glittered with prosperity hid behind their glass towers the quiet despair of tenements and hunger. Though she could not see these contrasts, she felt them in the vibrations of the world around her, the heaviness in people's touch, the weariness in their movements, the cold silence that filled the air between words. She began to understand that there existed not only physical blindness, but a blindness of conscience, a failure to perceive the suffering that progress demanded. It was this recognition that drew her from the comfortable margins of fame into the restless heart of social struggle. The transformation was neither sudden nor impulsive. It was a steady awakening, like the slow recognition of dawn through closed eyes. Reading had opened her to ideas that ignited her imagination. Emerson's belief in the transcendence of the soul, Ruskin's call for moral labor, Marx's plea for equality. She was not content to be a passive vessel of admiration. She wanted to act, to lend her mind and words to those whose lives were silenced by poverty. "I cannot see the faces of the poor," she once wrote, "but I have touched their hands, and I know that the world they labor for does not belong to them." Her growing convictions found expression in essays and speeches, often delivered to audiences who expected inspiration, but instead received confrontation. She spoke of social justice, of women's rights, of the dignity of labor, and of the spiritual sickness of a society that worshipped wealth while neglecting compassion. Her tone was calm but unyielding. Those who had loved her as a symbol of courage were unsettled by her transformation into a voice of dissent. Newspapers that had once praised her began to question her influences. Some accused Anne Sullivan of manipulating her beliefs, as if a woman who could not see or hear could not possibly think for herself. Helen met these accusations with grace, but without apology. "I am not the echo of another's thought," she signed to a journalist. "I am the sound of my own silence speaking." The years following her graduation from Radcliffe marked a period of fiery activism. Helen joined the Socialist Party of America, convinced that the inequities of industrial capitalism were incompatible with human dignity. Her writings appeared in radical journals, where her name, once a symbol of moral triumph, now stirred controversy. She wrote of the plight of workers, of women's suffrage, of the right to education and health care. Her pen moved slowly but purposefully, each word carved with conviction. "The world," she wrote, "is moved not by the noise of machines, but by the silent hopes of those who toil." Her compassion was not abstract, it was tactile, grounded in the physical reality of life as she experienced it. For Helen, to touch another human being was to understand that person's worth, and to feel the pulse of another's hand was to know the sacredness of existence itself. Anne Sullivan, though always at her side, struggled with the public's reaction to Helen's political turn. The lectures they gave together, once filled with applause and admiration, now met with murmurs of disapproval. Invitations from polite society began to dwindle. Some of Helen's benefactors withdrew their support, disappointed that she had chosen the path of agitation rather than gratitude. But Helen could not be swayed. "I have learned," she told Anne, "that silence is sometimes complicity. If I can speak, even through your hands, then I must." Anne understood, though the strain on her was immense. Her eyesight had worsened, her health faltered. Yet she continued to spell every word into Helen's hand, as if their shared purpose gave her the strength that medicine could not. Their travels during these years took them across the United States, from the lecture halls of universities to the crowded meeting rooms of labor unions. Helen met factory workers who pressed her hands in gratitude, women who worked long hours in mills and found in her presence a mirror of their own endurance. Though she could not see their faces, she memorized the shape of their calloused palms, the weight of their stories. In one of her speeches, she said, "I have touched the hands that build our cities and till our fields, and they are rough, but they are beautiful. They deserve to rest in the light." Her words were simple, yet they carried the authority of experience, the kind of truth that does not need sound to be heard. Her political awakening also led her into alliances with suffragists and pacifists. She believed that women's liberation was inseparable from the liberation of all humanity, and that war, no matter its justification, was the greatest failure of imagination. When the First World War erupted, Helen spoke out against it, denouncing it as a conflict fueled by greed rather than honor. This stance alienated her from many of her former admirers, yet she stood firm, writing, "The battlefield is but the visible symptom of a blindness deeper than any mine." Her use of blindness as metaphor was deliberate, a challenge to those who saw only her physical condition but refused to recognize their own moral limitations. At times, the intensity of her convictions strained her relationship with Anne, who worried for her safety and reputation. The constant travel, the debates, the letters, and the endless scrutiny left both women exhausted. Yet beneath the fatigue was a shared understanding that their lives had become inseparable from their mission. They were no longer merely individuals. They were a testament to the power of connection, to the faith that one person's enlightenment could ripple outward and touch many. Helen often said that she felt Anne's presence in her thoughts even when they were apart, that her teacher's patience had become the rhythm of her own inner voice. Despite the backlash, Helen continued to write with compassion rather than anger. She never condemned humanity. She sought to awaken it. "The light I cannot see," she wrote, "is the light I wish for all people, to perceive what lies beyond themselves." Her essays from this period reveal a vision both fierce and tender. She saw not enemies but sleepers, souls caught in the dimness of self-interest, unaware of their shared capacity for love. In her view, education was not the accumulation of knowledge, but the awakening of empathy. By the early 1920s, her activism had drawn international attention. Invitations arrived from abroad, from reformers and leaders who saw in her a universal symbol of conscience. She began to travel beyond the borders of the United States, carrying her message to other lands. Yet even as her influence expanded, she remained haunted by a simple truth. That change begins not in institutions, but in the human heart. "The world will never move by sight alone," she said, "but by the vision that lives in silence." That night, after one of her most challenging lectures, a speech that had divided the audience between admiration and anger, Helen sat quietly in her room, her hands folded in her lap. Anne was resting nearby, her breathing shallow, her body weakened by years of labor. Helen could feel the tremor of fatigue in the air. She reached out, found Anne's hand, and held it against her cheek. "You gave me my voice," she spelled softly, "and I have used it to disturb the peace. Forgive me." Anne, half asleep, smiled faintly and signed back. "You were meant to." Outside, the city pulsed with unseen lights, the streets echoing with sounds Helen could never hear. Yet in that stillness, she felt the heartbeat of the world, fierce, flawed, and beautiful. Her hands, which had once learned to speak the word water, now carried the fire of human conscience. And though her voice might never be heard in its full sound, its echo was already moving through the darkness, seeking those who would listen. The applause that once rang through lecture halls now often arrived as a strained echo. Admiration mingled with suspicion, reverence touched by unease. Helen Keller had crossed an invisible threshold. The public that once adored her for her triumph over silence now struggled to accept the clarity of the voice she had found. The saint of courage had become a woman of conviction, and the world preferred its saints quiet. Everywhere she went, she could feel the subtle shift in the air, the cautious politeness of audiences who praised her eloquence but shrank from her message. Newspapers still printed her name, but the tone had changed. They described her as brilliant but misguided, gentle yet dangerously radical, as though compassion itself could become subversive once it demanded justice. She had not changed. Only her listeners had, confronted at last with the uncomfortable truth that her light was not ornamental, but illuminating, and illumination exposes. For Helen, the years of public life had become a paradox. Fame had given her a platform, yet it had also built a cage around her. She was celebrated not as a thinker or a reformer, but as an emblem of perseverance, an inspiration safely detached from politics. When she spoke of literature or faith, the world listened with adoration. When she spoke of inequality, it turned away. "They love the miracle," she once told Anne, "but not the meaning of it." She began to see that being admired was not the same as being understood. Her words, filtered through others' hands and voices, often returned to her distorted, softened, reshaped to please the ears of the powerful. She could feel the edges of truth blunted in the retellings, like water poured into stone cups until the shape of its flow was lost. Anne Sullivan watched this with quiet pain. Her student, the child she had once guided through the miracle of language, now faced the more merciless arena of human opinion. The devotion between them had not dimmed, but Anne's body had begun to fail her. The years of teaching, of travel, of endless translation had worn her thin. Her eyes, clouded with old pain, saw less each season. Her joints ached from fatigue. Her nerves trembled under the strain of expectation. Yet she refused to rest, clinging to her role as Helen's bridge to the world. At lectures, she sat beside her pupil, spelling every word, her own breathing shallow from exhaustion. Afterward, she would collapse in the quiet of their hotel rooms, too proud to complain. Helen, who could feel every shift of the air, every tremor of distress, knew the truth even when Anne tried to hide it. There were nights when Anne would fall asleep before finishing her notes, her hands still half curled from spelling. Helen would sit awake beside her, tracing the familiar contours of those hands, remembering all they had built together, the alphabet of the world, the endless hours of patience, the shared triumphs and tears. She felt a tenderness that words could not express. "You gave me the universe," she signed once, her touch trembling with emotion. Anne, half awake, smiled faintly and replied, "Then make it worthy of you." It was not a command, but a blessing, and Helen carried it with her long after Anne's health began its steady decline. The public gaze grew heavier in those years. Helen's activism made her both admired and estranged. Organizations invited her to speak, yet carefully edited her remarks, trimming the sharper edges of her thought. Philanthropists who funded her work sometimes demanded she avoid controversial subjects. They wanted her courage without her challenge, her triumph without her truth. It was a pattern that repeated across her life, hands reaching out to honor her while simultaneously seeking to quiet her. She bore it with grace, but not without sorrow. "The world applauds what it can name," she wrote, "and fears what it cannot." Despite these struggles, Helen's work continued. She wrote essays that sought to reconcile her love of humanity with her disappointment in its blindness. She argued that progress without empathy was emptiness, that education without morality was dangerous. She believed deeply that the soul of a civilization could be measured by its kindness to those without power. Her words were gentle but unwavering, carried not by rhetoric, but by an almost sacred patience. She wrote as one who had learned that true hearing happens not with the ears, but with the heart. And yet behind her serenity lay fatigue, the kind of weariness that comes not from failure, but from the endless effort of pushing against indifference. Anne's health became a shadow that followed them everywhere. Doctors urged her to rest, to step back from the relentless schedule of travel and public appearances, but Anne dismissed them. Teaching Helen was not merely her vocation, it was her identity, the purpose that had given shape to her life. Without it, she feared she would fade. Helen, torn between love and guilt, tried to slow their pace, but the world's demands were constant. Every cause, every organization wanted her voice, and she could not refuse. To refuse felt like betrayal. To Anne, to the blind, to those who still lived in silence. And so they continued, bound together by duty and devotion, their days a rhythm of speeches and exhaustion, their nights a fragile sanctuary of mutual care. As Anne's strength waned, a quiet dread began to seep into Helen's consciousness. For the first time since childhood, she imagined the possibility of being alone, of navigating a world without the hands that had shaped her reality. The thought terrified her. Anne was not only her interpreter, but her compass, her anchor to meaning. When she tried to picture life without her, the edges of the world seemed to dissolve into formless dark. Yet she also knew that Anne's suffering could not be denied. In her private writings, Helen confessed that love is both a gift and a chain. It binds hearts together, but in doing so, it makes every separation unbearable. In 1936, the inevitable came quietly without thunder or spectacle. Anne Sullivan died, her body finally surrendering to years of strain and illness. Helen was with her in those last moments, holding her hand as she had held it since the day she first learned the word water. There were no words then, no lessons, only the soft rhythm of breath fading into stillness. When the silence deepened, Helen felt it not as emptiness, but as an echo of everything Anne had given her. A silence that spoke of completion. She wrote later that, "Death is not the extinguishing of light, but the putting out of the lamp, because the dawn has come." Yet for a long time, that dawn felt cold. After Anne's passing, Helen withdrew from public life for a while. The world that had once seemed vast now felt unbearably quiet. She moved through her days as if tracing familiar walls in darkness, searching for the outlines of purpose. Friends visited, companions came and went, but none could replace the hand that had once guided hers through the labyrinth of meaning. The newspapers wrote of her stoic composure, but they could not see the private ache that filled her nights, the silence that was no longer a language, but a void. And yet, as time passed, something gentle began to return, a whisper of movement beneath the grief. Helen discovered that Anne's absence had not left her empty. It had left her full of memory, of lessons that lived not in touch, but in being. She began to teach again, to write again, to travel once more. The love that had once sustained her now carried her forward. Anne had taught her that connection does not end with death, that those we truly touch remain within us, shaping every gesture, every word. She carried that truth into her later years, into every speech and essay, into every encounter with those who reached for her hand. The world, in all its blindness, continued to gaze upon her as a symbol, but Helen no longer resisted it. She understood now that symbols have their own quiet work, that sometimes, through misunderstanding, truth still travels. And so, she allowed the public to see what it wished, while within herself she nurtured the deeper flame, the unbroken dialogue with the teacher who had given her not sight or sound, but meaning. Outside her window, the world turned. The wars she had warned against came and went. The revolution she had envisioned rose and faltered. Yet she remained steadfast, a figure of stillness in motion, a reminder that even in the heaviest gaze, one can carry light unseen. In her solitude, she found again the rhythm of her earliest lessons, the feel of water, the warmth of sun, the certainty that understanding begins not with what we see, but with what we choose to feel. The world that unfolded after Anne Sullivan's death was not a different one in form or sound, but to Helen Keller, it felt like a landscape stripped of its center, as though the invisible compass that had always guided her had suddenly ceased to turn. For the first time in her life, there was no hand beside hers spelling out the contours of thought, no familiar rhythm of fingers echoing her inner voice. Silence, which had once been her companion, now pressed against her with a new weight, emptier, colder, less forgiving. In those first months, she lived as one moving through an echo of memory, repeating gestures and routines, not because they had meaning, but because they preserved shape in a formless time. Anne's absence was not only the loss of a teacher or a friend, it was the loss of the mirror through which Helen had seen the world. For nearly 50 years, they had shared a consciousness. Now, every thought Helen formed felt as if it reached into a void where no answering touch would return. Yet grief, for Helen, did not arrive as despair, but as stillness. She had learned long ago that sorrow is a kind of instruction, another teacher sent by the same hand that gives joy. In her private journals, she wrote that, "Love is a light that never leaves its object. It only changes its form." She felt Anne everywhere, in the movement of air through an open window, in the warmth of sunlight on her face, in the pulse of words flowing through her own hands. Slowly, she began to understand that their connection had never been of flesh alone. It had been of spirit, and spirit, she believed, could not die. That conviction became the quiet foundation upon which she began to rebuild her days. Polly Thompson, who had long served as Anne's assistant, stepped into the role of companion and interpreter. She was practical, loyal, and deeply devoted to Helen's work, but their relationship was different, less mystical, more grounded. Polly's Scottish precision contrasted with Anne's fierce emotional intensity. With her, Helen entered a gentler rhythm of life. Together they moved to a small home in Forest Hills, where the days passed in patterns of reading, writing, and correspondence. The house was filled with visitors, yet beneath the laughter and discussion, there always lingered a trace of absence, a silence that neither could fully dispel. Helen often sat by the window during these visits, her hand resting idly in Polly's, smiling politely but withdrawing inward, as if searching for a voice she could no longer touch. Her writing in these years carried a new tone, still luminous but touched by the gravity of loss. Gone was the fervent idealism of her youth. In its place grew a quieter wisdom, an acceptance of life's paradoxes. She no longer wrote to change the world, but to understand it. "There is a dignity," she wrote, "in enduring what cannot be changed and in continuing to seek light even when the eyes cannot open." She spoke of death not with fear but with curiosity, describing it as the final translation of silence. Her essays from this period read less like manifestos and more like meditations, reflections on memory, time, and the continuity of love beyond form. Critics called them elegiac, but Helen herself thought of them as letters to Anne, letters written not to summon the dead, but to thank them for having lived. Despite her personal sorrow, she did not retreat entirely into solitude. The world still called to her, and she still answered. Invitations came from organizations for the blind, for veterans, for students, and she traveled tirelessly, accompanied by Polly, to bring hope where she could. Each journey was both a duty and a form of healing. She found comfort in giving herself to others, in knowing that her presence could ease someone's isolation, even briefly. When she visited hospitals and schools, she would take the hands of those she met, letting them feel her warmth. And though she could not see their tears, she always sensed them. She would say, "The touch of another's hand is proof that we are never truly alone." It was more than sentiment, it was belief made flesh. Her travels took her across the ocean to Japan, India, and Europe, where her name had already become legend. Everywhere she went, she was received with reverence. Crowds gathered not to witness a curiosity, but to meet a symbol of perseverance. In those encounters, Helen felt again the power of connection that had first awakened her at the water pump. She could not hear the applause, but she could feel its vibration through the floor, could sense the collective breath of the audience as they leaned toward her. And though she no longer had Anne's hand to interpret the words spoken about her, Polly's steady guidance carried the thread of meaning. Through those countless meetings, Helen came to understand that influence was not the same as fame. It was the quiet transmission of courage, the invisible passing of light from one life to another. Yet behind the public devotion lay fatigue. The endless travel wore on her body. Her eyesight, already symbolic rather than functional, darkened further with age. The energy that had once fueled her writing began to wane. There were days when even her hands ached from use, and she would sit quietly letting the world move around her in gentle patterns of touch and air. It was during one of these reflective spells that she wrote, "There are silences that heal and silences that wound. I have lived both, and I have learned that love is the sound between them." It was a line that captured the entire rhythm of her life, the oscillation between loss and endurance, between grief and grace. Polly, though efficient and disciplined, often felt the pressure of replacing the irreplaceable. She loved Helen deeply, but there were moments when the weight of expectation threatened to crush her. Helen, sensing this, treated her with tenderness, never allowing the old dynamic of teacher and student to return. With Polly, she was equal, a companion rather than a pupil. In that equality, there grew a kind of peace that she had never known before, a peace born not of achievement, but of acceptance. They lived simply, their days measured by reading, correspondence, and the small rituals that gave shape to solitude. And yet, even in her later years, Helen's mind remained restless. She continued to question, to wonder, to reach for meaning beyond what could be touched or spoken. She wrote often of time, describing it not as a line, but as a circle, where all moments coexist and all love endures. "I have lived many lives," she wrote, "and all of them are still living in me." She believed that memory was not something held in the mind but in the soul, and that those we love become the texture of our being. In that sense, Anne was never gone. She was the unseen thread in every thought, the rhythm behind every sentence. As the years advanced, Helen's travels became less frequent, her public appearances fewer. She no longer sought to lead movements or reform systems. Her influence had already ripened into something quieter, more enduring, a kind of moral gravity that did not demand attention but drew it naturally. The young reformers who came to visit her often left changed, sensing that they had touched something timeless. She would smile gently when they spoke of the world they hoped to build, encouraging them to keep faith with both reason and compassion. "Progress," she told one visitor, "is the slow discovery of how to see each other." At night, in her quiet house, she would sometimes sit by the window, feeling the cool air on her face. The world outside was dark, but she no longer feared darkness. It had been her companion since birth, and she had come to recognize in it a kind of truth, an honesty that light often conceals. Somewhere beyond that darkness, she imagined Anne waiting, not as a ghost, but as a continuation of love itself, the eternal dialogue that never ends. She would press her hand against her heart and smile, whispering to herself through touch the word that had begun it all: water, the symbol of flow, of renewal, of unbroken life. And in that whisper of movement, in that unseen current of memory, Helen Keller learned again the lesson that had shaped her entire being, that loss, when carried with love, is not an ending, but a transformation, and that even in silence, the human spirit continues to speak. When Helen Keller set sail across the oceans, it was as though the horizon itself reached out to welcome her, sensing in her a kindred restlessness, a traveler whose vision was not confined to the eyes. The world she encountered in those years after Anne's death was vast, fractured, and weary from the wounds of war. Yet her arrival in every port carried an inexplicable calm, a reminder that resilience was not confined to strength, but born of gentleness. She could not see the faces that greeted her, nor hear the cheers that followed her from the docks to the halls of reception, but she felt their warmth rise toward her in waves of air and motion. Her travels were not those of a tourist, nor even of a dignitary. They were pilgrimages of empathy. Each journey was an act of faith, a declaration that touch and understanding could travel farther than sound, that humanity itself was one continuous conversation. Polly Thompson was now her companion, interpreter, and guardian of both schedule and body. Together they crossed continents, from the serene temples of Japan to the crowded streets of Calcutta, from the libraries of London to the deserts of Egypt. Helen experienced each place not through the eyes of sight, but through the body's deeper senses. The vibration of footsteps on cobblestones, the smell of spice in the markets, the rhythm of air between the pillars of ancient ruins. Every texture was a history. Every hand that touched hers a story. She would later write that travel for her was to walk inside the heart of humanity. Wherever she went, she was met not with curiosity but reverence. For the world had learned to see in her not just a woman, but a symbol of endurance made human. Her speeches abroad were delivered through Polly's voice, but it was Helen's presence that gave them their power. Crowds listened with a kind of hushed awe. They watched her stillness as her hands moved in measured grace, her fingers weaving ideas that transcended language. She spoke not only of the rights of the blind, but of the need for compassion as a moral law. In Japan, school children lined the roads, holding small flags, and when she touched their hands, she smiled and said later that she could feel their joy as a current of light through her palms. In India, she met leaders of independence and reform, men and women whose faith in human dignity resonated deeply with her. They told her that her courage gave strength to those still bound by oppression, and she replied, "Courage is not given. It is found in the space between suffering and hope." In each nation, she sought out the unseen, the forgotten, the disabled, the impoverished, and through her presence gave them visibility. Her visits to hospitals were quiet but profound. She would walk among the beds, feeling the shape of a hand, the trembling of a pulse, the faintest breath of gratitude. She did not need to speak. Her nearness was enough. Many who met her later said they felt as if she had seen them, even though her eyes were blind. It was not sight they sensed, but attention. The pure, unjudging presence of one who had long ago learned that to feel another's existence is to honor it. The media followed her travels with fascination. Photographs of Helen, her face serene, her hand resting in Polly's, appeared in newspapers around the world. Governments invited her to state dinners, and dignitaries bent low to speak into her touch. Yet behind the ceremony, Helen felt the same quiet melancholy that had always haunted her, the knowledge that admiration often replaces understanding. She wished not to be celebrated as exceptional, but to remind others of the ordinary miracle of empathy. "I am not special," she wrote from Cairo, "only willing to listen to the silence in others." Her journey was also a test of endurance. The travel was physically punishing, the climates unfamiliar, the pace unrelenting. Polly, ever dutiful, managed the logistics, ensuring Helen's safety and rest, but both women aged visibly with each new voyage. Their lives had become an endless rhythm of movement and reception, the cost of carrying light across darkness. Yet for Helen, fatigue was a form of offering. Each journey was another act of connection, another bridge over the abyss of misunderstanding that divided people and nations. "If I can remind even one person," she said, "that the invisible binds us more deeply than the visible, then the road is worth the dust." The world, however, was shifting again. The optimism of the early century was giving way to a new unease, the rise of divisions, the murmurs of coming conflict. In Europe, the remnants of one war still smoldered beneath the surface, while in Asia, the storms of ambition gathered. Helen sensed it in the air, though no one told her directly. She could feel the heaviness in the rooms where officials spoke, the tension in the hands that greeted her. She was too wise to be deceived by ceremony. "The air before a storm," she wrote, "has a taste I have come to know. It is the taste of fear disguised as order." Despite the political turbulence, her mission remained steady. She spoke tirelessly of peace, of international understanding, of the need to protect the vulnerable from the blindness of power. Her faith was never naive. She did not believe that goodwill alone could save the world, but she believed that compassion could humanize it. When people told her she was idealistic, she answered that idealism is the realism of the heart. Her words carried the quiet authority of one who had wrestled with darkness and chosen light not because it was easy, but because it was the only path that did not lead to despair. As she aged, her perception of the world deepened into something almost mystical. She spoke often of feeling the interconnectedness of all life, the pulse of trees, the hum of the earth, the silent conversation between stars. When asked what she thought God was, she replied simply, "The infinite touch of all things." For Helen, spirituality was not a doctrine but an experience, the realization that every being shared the same current of existence. This belief gave her comfort during moments of loneliness and renewed her purpose even as her strength began to wane. In her late 60s, Helen returned to the United States after one of her longest international tours. The voyage home was slow, the ship cutting through endless waves. She spent much of it standing on deck, her hand resting lightly on the rail, feeling the motion of the ocean beneath her. She said it reminded her of the word water, the first revelation of her life, and how every new understanding since had been another form of that same lesson, the flow of meaning, the continuity of touch. Polly stood beside her, translating letters and articles, but for long stretches they said nothing. The sea itself seemed to speak. When the ship finally reached the harbor, Helen felt the vibration of cheers through the wooden deck. Reporters waited, cameras flashing, questions flying. She smiled and raised her hand in greeting, unaware of how frail she appeared, her white hair gleaming in the sunlight she could not see. To the watching world, she was still the symbol of triumph, but within her was a gentler truth. She no longer sought to conquer darkness. She had learned to dwell within it peacefully. That night, in her cabin, she lay awake listening to the rhythm of the sea against the hull. The motion soothed her, steady and eternal. She thought of Anne, of all the hands she had held, all the faces she had never seen but somehow known. Her life had been one long journey across the invisible distances that separate human beings. And as the ship rocked softly toward home, she smiled into the darkness, feeling not the end of travel but its completion, the understanding that every journey, no matter how far, is only a circle returning to love. The world that awaited Helen Keller after her return was changed, not only in its cities and politics, but in its spirit. The optimism that had colored the early years of her activism had begun to fade beneath the shadow of a second Great War. She could feel the tension in the air, in the hurried footsteps on the streets, in the tremor of people's hands as they greeted her. Even before anyone spoke of conflict, she sensed its approach. The silence of anticipation was unmistakable to one who had lived her life attuned to subtler vibrations. When the war finally came, it did not surprise her. It merely confirmed what she had already felt pulsing beneath the surface of the age. For Helen, war was the ultimate expression of blindness, a willful refusal to see the humanity in others. "The darkness I have lived in," she wrote, "has never frightened me as much as the darkness that lives in men's hearts." She was 60 at the time, her body frail but her purpose unbroken. The world she had spoken to for decades was now tearing itself apart, and yet she refused to retreat into despair. Instead, she found within the catastrophe a deeper calling. She began visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals across the country, men who had lost limbs, sight, and hope. Her presence among them carried a strange and quiet power. She did not speak of bravery or glory. She took their hands, felt their trembling, and shared her silence with them. Through that silence, something wordless passed between them, a recognition, an understanding that pain, when faced without bitterness, can become a form of light. Doctors often remarked that morale improved after her visits, though no one could quite explain why. Helen herself said only that to suffer and still love is the highest act of seeing. Her work with veterans deepened her belief in the redemptive strength of the human spirit. She met men who had lost their sight to war and yet learned to find meaning again through touch, through learning, through art. In their darkness, she saw reflections of her own past, the confusion, the rage, the surrender, and finally the acceptance that life, even diminished, remains sacred. To each of them she brought the same message Anne Sullivan had once brought to her. that the walls which imprison us are often built within, and that the mind, once awakened, can make even silence sing. Her words carried no trace of sentimentality. They came instead with the calm authority of experience, the quiet assurance of one who had long since made peace with the unseen. The war also brought Helen into new prominence as an advocate for peace. She spoke before organizations and governments, urging reconciliation and compassion. Her pacifism, long derided as naive, now found renewed urgency in a world drowning in destruction. "We fight blindness with weapons," she said, "when only sight of the heart can end it." Her speeches were translated into dozens of languages, carried across the airwaves, read aloud in churches and classrooms. Yet she took little pride in her influence. Fame had long ceased to thrill her. It had become a burden she carried out of duty rather than desire. She understood that the world often hears only what comforts it, and she feared that her voice, even when amplified, reached too few hearts willing to change. Still, she persisted, guided by the belief that a single act of understanding could outlast generations of hatred. Polly Thompson remained faithfully at her side through these years, organizing schedules, interpreting letters, guarding her from the physical toll of travel. Their companionship was one of quiet endurance, less fiery than the partnership she had shared with Anne, but steadier, grounded in mutual care. Polly had learned how to read Helen's moods without words, how to guide her gently when fatigue overtook her. Sometimes, after long days of visits and speeches, they would sit together by the fire, Helen's hand resting in Polly's, the room filled only with the crackling of wood and the breathing of two women who had given their lives to the service of others. Helen often thought of Anne in these moments, and though she no longer grieved, she still felt her presence hovering like a light just beyond reach. "She is the dawn that never fades," she once wrote in a private letter. In the midst of war's chaos, Helen found herself turning inward again, reflecting on the strange symmetry of her life. The girl who had once discovered the word water at a pump in Alabama had now spent decades teaching the world that even in the darkest places, something pure still flows. She saw the war not only as destruction but as revelation, the tearing away of illusions that had long blinded nations. To her, the violence of the age was proof that humanity still had much to learn about love. "We mistake sound for truth," she said, "and light for vision. Perhaps when all the noise is gone, we will finally listen." When the war ended, the world greeted peace with relief, but Helen sensed that the deeper sickness remained, the blindness of indifference. In the ruins of Europe and the hunger of Asia, she felt the pulse of suffering that victory could not erase, and yet she refused to yield to cynicism. Instead, she began traveling again, this time not to lecture but to console, to witness. She visited schools for the blind and hospitals for the wounded, moving quietly through rooms where silence was heavy. Her presence was not grand or dramatic. It was gentle, almost luminous. Children reached for her hands as if they were lanterns. Soldiers, once hardened, wept as she touched their faces. She could not see them, but she knew them by the warmth of their skin, by the unspoken gratitude that passed between bodies. In Japan, she visited Hiroshima, walking among the survivors and feeling through her hands the delicate tremor of their grief. She did not flinch or withdraw. She stood silently, letting the air speak to her of sorrow and endurance. Later she wrote that the city's silence was not deathly but sacred, a silence that carried both mourning and rebirth. "There is a light that grows only in ruins," she wrote, "and it is made of forgiveness." Those words would be quoted for decades, though few could fully grasp the depth from which they came. For Helen, forgiveness was not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of it into understanding. As she aged, her body weakened, but her spirit only sharpened. The more she lost in strength, the more she gained in clarity. She spoke less often in public now, choosing instead to write, to reflect, to reach people through letters rather than crowds. Her later writings from this period carry the quiet authority of one who has seen enough of the world to know that truth does not need to shout. They were filled with compassion for humanity's failings, but also with faith in its potential. She wrote of the blind and the poor, but always as teachers, not victims. The sightless, she said, live at the heart of truth, for they are forced to see what others overlook. Polly worried about Helen's health, about the long journeys, the endless requests for appearances, the strain of constant correspondence. But Helen, though frail, seemed animated by something beyond her body. She would smile when Polly scolded her for working too much and reply, "I am only resting when I give." To her, service was not obligation but renewal, the way one keeps the light within from fading. Even in illness, she radiated a serenity that calmed everyone who came near her. People often said that to meet her was to feel the world slow down, as if her silence carried its own rhythm that drew everything towards stillness. In those final years of travel, Helen came to understand what she had been seeking all along: not knowledge, not recognition, but communion. The boundaries between self and other, between the visible and invisible, seemed to dissolve. She no longer felt confined to her body's limitations. The world had become an immense pulse, and she could feel its beating even in solitude. "There is no blindness," she wrote near the end of the war, "when one learns to see with love." And so, when the plains finally fell silent and the cities rebuilt themselves from ashes, Helen did not celebrate victory. She simply continued, quietly and steadily, moving through the aftermath with the same grace with which she had once moved through gardens and classrooms. To her, peace was not the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. And in her calm persistence, she became what she had always been, a living testament to the light that exists even within darkness, a reminder that true vision begins where sight ends. In the years after the war, as the world tried to make sense of both its survival and its sorrow, Helen Keller withdrew more deeply into reflection. The noise of public life began to fade, and in its place she entered a quieter realm of thought, an inner world where the questions that had lingered all her life grew sharper, more luminous. She had spent decades teaching others how to feel the invisible, how to find meaning without sight or sound, and now, in the solitude of her later years, she turned that same gaze inward, seeking to understand what it truly meant to perceive. The house in Forest Hills had grown still. Polly Thompson managed the letters, the visitors, the foundations that bore Helen's name, while Helen herself spent long hours sitting by the window, her face tilted slightly toward the sun, her fingers resting lightly against the arm of her chair as though feeling the vibration of time itself. To an observer, she appeared motionless, but within her, thought moved with the quiet force of a river beneath ice. She began to write again, not the public essays of her earlier career, but intimate meditations, notebooks filled with reflections that she never intended for publication. In them, she wrestled with questions of consciousness, of the boundaries between mind and matter, of whether perception was a sense or a state of grace. She had once believed that touch was the bridge between her and the world, but now she wondered if there was something beyond even touch, a kind of knowing that transcended the body altogether. "Perhaps," she wrote, "we do not see with our eyes or hear with our ears, but with something deeper that lies behind both. Perhaps perception is the soul remembering what it already knows." Her interest in philosophy, always present, now became her central occupation. She revisited the works of Plato, Spinoza, and Kant through the lens of her own experience. She felt kinship with Plato's notion that the physical world was but a shadow of higher truth, for she herself had lived her life in shadow, yet had found within it the light of understanding. Of Spinoza, she wrote, "He saw God in everything, as I have felt him in all that I touch." She read also the writings of the emerging thinkers of her own time, Teilhard de Chardin, William James, the mystics of East and West, and in them she found echoes of her lifelong intuition. That reality is not merely what is perceived, but what is felt through unity. To her, philosophy was not an abstract pursuit, but a continuation of her earliest lessons. The pump that had taught her the word water had also taught her that essence is invisible. In her correspondence with scholars and spiritual leaders, she began to articulate a vision of perception as a moral act. To perceive, she believed, was not simply to register stimuli, but to recognize connection, to see the self in all things. Blindness, in this sense, was not a limitation but a liberation from distraction, a way of seeing more truthfully. "When one's eyes are closed," she wrote to a friend, "the mind opens wider. I live in a vast space of impressions, of warmth and movement, where nothing is separate. The universe is not before me, it is within me." This belief did not arise from mysticism alone, but from lived reality. For Helen, the physical world had always been porous. The vibration of a passing carriage, the brush of wind, the pulse of another's hand. These were not sensations, but sentences in the larger language of existence. She often reflected on how others perceived her condition. People pitied her for what she lacked, yet she felt that their senses imprisoned them far more than her silence ever had. "They see everything," she said, "but notice nothing. Their eyes glide over the miracles of the world as if they were dust." To her, blindness was not absence, but focus, the narrowing of perception that reveals its depth. She believed that most people mistook seeing for understanding, hearing for listening, and that the true act of perception required humility, the willingness to be touched by what one encounters. Her life had been proof of that. From the water pump to the lecture hall, she had received the world not as a spectacle, but as communion. In her later writings, Helen began to express what could only be called a philosophy of touch. To her, touch was not merely sensory, it was spiritual. "Through touch," she wrote, "I enter the world of others. I know anger by the tightening of a hand, joy by its trembling, sorrow by the weight of stillness. Touch is the purest language, for it lies beneath all deceit." She described it as the universal sense, the foundation upon which all perception rests. Sight and hearing, she believed, were extensions of touch, for even light and sound were vibrations moving through space. The realization filled her with reverence. She began to see herself not as limited, but as refined, a being who had learned to feel truth at its most elemental level. Visitors who came to see her during those years often remarked on the serenity of her presence. Though age had curved her back and slowed her movements, there was a radiance about her that seemed undiminished. She would greet guests by taking their hands in hers, holding them with gentle firmness, and in that single gesture, she seemed to draw them into her world of heightened awareness. Conversations with her were unhurried, deliberate. She would pause often, her head slightly tilted, as though listening to something far away, and then she would respond with words that felt less spoken than revealed. Many left her house in tears, unsure whether they had been instructed or blessed. Polly managed these visits with care, aware that Helen's strength was not infinite. Yet she also understood that these encounters nourished her friend, giving her purpose in the stillness of age. After guests departed, Helen would often sit quietly for a long time, her fingers moving slowly as if writing in the air. When Polly asked what she was thinking, she would answer, "I am reading what they left behind." To Helen, every person carried a vibration, a signature of being that lingered even after their departure. In the absence of sound, she felt the resonance of others more keenly than most ever could. Her reflections on perception began to extend toward the divine. She had always believed in God, but not in the conventional sense of doctrine. To her, God was not a distant figure, but the pulse that bound all life together, the silent harmony that vibrated beneath creation. "If I have known God," she wrote, "it is because I have felt His warmth in the sunlight, His movement in the wind, His patience in the hands that have touched mine." She did not pray in words, but in stillness, letting her thoughts dissolve into a vast quiet that felt both personal and infinite. In her old age, her spirituality was neither comfort nor creed. It was a recognition that the unseen was more real than the visible, that the truest form of perception was reverence. As her health declined, Helen came to regard her own body as a temporary vessel of awareness. The pain of arthritis in her hands, the fatigue in her bones, the occasional confusion of old age, all of it she accepted with equanimity. "The body," she wrote, "is the language of the soul, but even languages fade. What remains is meaning." She no longer feared death. To her, it was simply the next translation of experience, another way of perceiving the eternal. In one of her final essays, she returned to the image that had begun her life's journey, the moment when water flowed over her hand and language was born. "That day," she wrote, "I learned that touch reveals more than it conceals. Everything I have known since has been another form of that revelation. The soul, too, is a kind of hand, reaching outward, finding the shape of love in the dark." The days passed in increasing stillness. Polly continued her work beside her, reading letters, tending to the garden, keeping the rhythm of their life steady. Visitors came less often, but those who did felt the rare privilege of entering a mind that had transcended the limits of human perception. Helen, though aged and weary, remained luminous. To those who asked if she still longed for sight, she would smile faintly and sign, "No, I have seen too much already." At night, when the house settled into quiet, she would sit by the open window, feeling the faint breeze move through the curtains. The air carried with it the pulse of the earth, the distant motion of trees, the unending dialogue of the living. She would rest her hands on the windowsill and whisper into the dark, not with words, but with feeling. And in that silence, vast and complete, she would sense the presence of all that she had ever known, the voices of the blind, the warmth of Anne's hand, the laughter of distant children, the unseen radiance of stars. All of it merged within her, a single endless perception. The house where Helen Keller spent her later years stood in quiet conversation with time itself. Its walls, thick with memory, seemed to breathe with her. Each room a chamber of echoes, each window a threshold between her inner stillness and the faint, continuous murmur of the world beyond. Inside that home, Helen moved through her days not as a recluse, but as a contemplative soul, gathering meaning from silence as others might gather light from morning. The outside world still reached for her, letters, visitors, students, but her attention now turned inward, toward the secret landscape of memory and spirit that had always been her truest home. It was there, in that vast interior space she called her inner room, that she began to dwell almost completely, as if she were preparing for a journey that did not require movement. She woke each morning to the same ritual. Polly would open the curtains so that the sunlight could spill into the room, and Helen would lift her face toward its warmth, greeting the invisible day. Then she would ask for her desk and papers, her fingers moving slowly over the keys of her typewriter or across the raised lines of her notes. The words came more slowly now. Her hands ached from years of use. Her energy waned quickly, yet the rhythm of thought remained unbroken. Writing had always been her way of ordering the world, and even in old age it still anchored her. She wrote not of politics or reform any longer, but of small, profound truths, the nature of solitude, the weight of memory, the mysterious tenderness of aging. "I live now," she once typed, "in the hush between what has been and what will be." The inner room she spoke of was not a physical space, but a state of being. It was where the voices of her past gathered, not as ghosts, but as living presences. Anne, her parents, the countless souls she had met across decades of travel. Sometimes she would sit for hours, her hands folded, her face calm, and when Polly asked what she was thinking, she would reply, "I am listening." Listening, for Helen, was no longer the act of receiving information, but of attuning herself to the subtle continuity between the living and the departed. She had come to believe that all consciousness was a single thread, that every life vibrated on the same unseen current, and that death was only a deepening of silence, not its end. Her inner life had always been rich, but now it seemed to glow with a new clarity. She no longer sought meaning in the grand movements of the world, but in the delicate textures of being, the warmth of tea between her palms, the roughness of paper beneath her fingers, the brush of Polly's hand as it guided her through the garden. She had learned to find infinity in the smallest moments, to feel eternity in each breath. Visitors who came to see her expected a woman of solemn wisdom, but what struck them instead was her lightness. She laughed often, not loudly, but with a serenity that seemed to dissolve all heaviness. "Laughter," she told one guest, "is the soul's way of seeing itself." Yet beneath this tranquility there remained a deep current of longing, not for sight or sound, but for unity, for the reunion of all things that had once been divided. Her spiritual beliefs, shaped by years of study and reflection, had crystallized into a quiet certainty that all life was part of one vast consciousness, and that every act of love or understanding drew us closer to its center. She had ceased to pray for miracles and instead prayed for awareness, the awareness that love itself was the miracle. "We spend our lives seeking what already holds us," she wrote, "and only in silence do we finally feel its touch." The passing of years had thinned the boundaries between her memories and her present. She often revisited moments from her childhood, not with nostalgia, but with wonder, as if they were still unfolding somewhere beyond time. The water pump in Alabama, the scent of spring magnolia, Anne's fingers spelling words into her palm, all returned to her with vivid immediacy. She felt no grief in recalling them. Rather, she experienced them as living truths, as if memory itself were proof of the soul's continuity. Sometimes she would smile without explanation, and Polly would ask what amused her. "I remembered the sound of water," Helen would say softly, "not its noise, but its life." Her home became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought her wisdom. Students, writers, reformers, and admirers traveled long distances to meet her. They entered her parlor with reverence, some with trembling hands, uncertain what to say. Helen, always gracious, would take their hands and hold them firmly, drawing them into her quiet world. There, speech slowed and awareness deepened. She would ask about their work, their hopes, their fears, and she listened with an attentiveness that disarmed even the most anxious. When they asked her for advice, she would say, "Do not be afraid to listen to what is not said. The world speaks most clearly in silence." Many left feeling changed, as though they had glimpsed a way of being untouched by distraction or noise. Polly watched these encounters with affection and awe. She knew that Helen's body was failing. Her joints stiffened, her breathing grew shallow, but her presence seemed only to grow larger. There were moments when Polly felt she was caring not for a person, but for a flame, a steady light that illuminated everyone it touched. The correspondence that arrived daily reflected this. Letters came from every corner of the globe, written by people who had never met Helen yet felt they knew her. Some wrote to thank her for her courage, others for her compassion. Helen dictated replies to as many as she could. Her answers were brief but tender, often ending with the words, "Hold to love. It is the vision that never dims." In her solitude, Helen often contemplated the mystery of aging, the gradual loosening of the self from the world. She did not resent it. She saw it as nature's way of teaching detachment. The body weakened so that the soul might learn to stand freely. The decline of the senses, she wrote, is the unveiling of spirit. Even pain had become a kind of teacher. When arthritis twisted her fingers and movement grew difficult, she saw in it not punishment, but transformation. Every limitation, she mused, is an invitation to discover new ways of being. Her reflections in these final years carried an almost musical rhythm, a poetry born not of structure but of feeling. She wrote of the night as a companion rather than a shadow, of dreams as the meeting place of the living and the dead. She imagined death not as departure but as homecoming. "When I go," she wrote, "I shall step not into darkness but into sound, the sound I have never heard but always felt. I think it will be like water flowing endlessly, returning to its source." As her strength declined, Polly became both nurse and guardian. She tended to Helen with devotion, sensing the sacredness of every remaining day. They no longer spoke often. They no longer needed to. Their bond had ripened into the kind of understanding that requires only presence. Some evenings they would sit together in the garden, where the scent of roses drifted through the air, and Helen would lift her face toward the wind. "I hear them," she would say, and Polly knew she meant the leaves, the unseen voices of the living world. When night came, Helen would retire to her room, the inner room that was both sanctuary and threshold. There she would sit for a while before sleeping, her hands folded in her lap, her breath even, her face serene. She no longer prayed for sight or sound, for her prayers had already been answered in another form. She prayed only that her life, however small a thread in the vast tapestry, might continue to weave light into the unseen pattern of things. And as the darkness settled around her, she would smile faintly, sensing that the walls of her room were dissolving, that beyond them stretched the great quiet she had always known, the silence that listens back. Age came to Helen Keller not as an intruder, but as an old acquaintance, a presence that slipped quietly into the corners of her days, softening the edges of urgency, teaching her the slow rhythm of acceptance. She did not resist it. Resistance had never been her way. She had met every stage of life with curiosity rather than fear, and so she welcomed age as yet another teacher, one that spoke in silence and revealed its lessons through stillness. Her body, once tireless in its service to her mind, began to falter. Her steps grew shorter, her hands trembled, her breathing carried the faint rasp of fatigue. But within her, something grew lighter, clearer. "Time," she wrote, "does not steal from us. It merely takes away what we no longer need to carry." The years that had once stretched before her like an open road now gathered themselves into a circle, each moment folding back into memory, into meaning. Polly Thompson remained at her side, tending to her with the unyielding devotion of a friend who had long ago accepted that love's truest form is caretaking. Their days followed a quiet pattern: mornings of correspondence, afternoons in the garden, evenings by the fire. The work that had once consumed Helen, the speeches, the campaigns, the endless travel, had slowed to a gentle trickle. The world still wrote to her, still sought her blessing or her words, and she answered when she could, her messages brief but luminous. "Be kind," she often wrote, "for it is the only thing worth learning." When visitors arrived, she greeted them with her familiar warmth, but they sensed the fragility beneath her composure. Her hair had turned completely white, her figure delicate as porcelain, and yet her presence carried the same quiet radiance it always had. Age, it seemed, had not diminished her. It had distilled her. There were days, however, when the shadows lengthened and weariness pressed more heavily upon her. On those days, she would sit by the window for hours, her face turned toward the faint warmth of sunlight, her hands resting still upon her lap. She said little, though Polly could tell when her thoughts had turned to the past. "Do you remember the pump?" she asked once, her voice thin but steady. Polly squeezed her hand and nodded, and Helen smiled faintly. "Sometimes," she said, "I feel that moment still flowing through me as if the water never stopped. Perhaps nothing ever really stops. It just changes its current." The idea comforted her. The flow of time, the movement of memory, the continuity of love, all seemed to her part of the same great stream. In these twilight years, she spoke often of Anne Sullivan, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Anne's presence had never left her. It had simply become quieter, like a candle's glow that remains long after the flame has gone out. Helen felt her in the pulse of every word she typed, in the rhythm of every thought. "She was my eyes," she wrote once, "but also my mirror. Through her, I saw myself, and through me, she learned to see again." She believed their bond had transcended the boundaries of life and death, that somewhere, in the unseen layers of existence, their souls continued to converse in silence. "Love," she told Polly, "is the language that never dies." Though her physical world had grown smaller, her inner world expanded without limit. She read as much as her strength allowed, dictating letters to Polly or listening as passages were spelled into her hand. The subjects that occupied her now were less about reform and more about essence, love, mortality, and the invisible threads that connect all living things. She wrote, "To grow old is to become transparent. The soul begins to show through." It was true of her. Those who met her in these later years often described the strange peace that surrounded her, as if she carried within her the stillness of a lake untouched by wind. She no longer spoke of struggle or achievement. The word that returned again and again in her writings was grace. Grace in suffering, grace in loss, grace in the act of being alive at all. Polly noticed, too, that Helen had become increasingly inward. Conversations would trail off into silence, and she would sit motionless, her face serene. Polly, out of habit, would ask what she was thinking, though she already knew the answer. "Nothing," Helen would sign softly, "and everything." She had come to dwell in that space where thought dissolves into awareness, where the self blends into the greater whole. For her, aging was not decline, but return, a return to simplicity, to wonder, to the same openness with which she had first discovered language. The cycle of her life was closing with the same grace with which it had begun. Outside, the world continued to change. Wars ended and began again. New inventions altered the way people lived and spoke. The radio, the television, the airplane, all things that she had never seen yet, felt the pulse of through others' excitement, transformed the landscape of human connection. Helen marveled at them, though she was skeptical of the noise they brought. "We make machines to speak for us," she said once, "but we have not yet learned to listen." The irony was not lost on her. A woman without hearing had spent her life teaching others how to listen. She saw in this technological age both promise and peril, the capacity to bridge distances, but also the danger of forgetting presence. To her, progress meant little without intimacy. "It is not communication we lack," she wrote, "but communion." Her final public appearances were quiet and understated. She no longer delivered long speeches, but brief messages of hope, often read aloud by others. When she appeared, audiences would rise instinctively to their feet, not in pity but in reverence. Her mere presence seemed to gather people into stillness. In those moments, as she stood with her hand lightly on Polly's arm, she felt not pride, but humility. "I am only a traveler," she wrote afterward, "carrying the message I was given at the well, that life flows, where love is allowed to move freely." As her health declined, Helen began to prepare herself for the inevitable with the same patience that had marked every other passage in her life. She spoke of death not as a loss, but as a continuation. "It is the next great discovery," she told a friend. "I think of it as learning a new language." Her humor remained intact, gentle and unself-conscious. When Polly once asked if she feared dying, Helen smiled and signed, "Why should I fear what I've already practiced all my life, entering darkness and finding light within it?" The simplicity of that truth held everything she had ever believed. In her final winters, she rarely left the house. The garden that had once been her sanctuary now existed only in scent and memory. The warmth of soil, the whisper of leaves, the gentle brush of petals. Yet she felt no deprivation. "All gardens are one garden," she wrote, "and it grows inside us." She spent her last years tending to that inner garden, watering it with reflection, pruning it with acceptance. Her visitors noticed that her presence seemed almost translucent, as if she were already half elsewhere. On one quiet evening, as dusk gathered outside her window, Helen sat with Polly in silence. The light that seeped through the curtains was soft and golden, the kind of light that belongs more to memory than to day. Helen lifted her hand toward it, feeling the air, and said, "This feels like evening in my soul, not darkness, but rest." Polly, unable to speak, simply pressed her hand. They stayed like that for a long time, motionless, while the shadows deepened around them. The room grew dim, but there was no fear in it, only stillness, only peace. And so the shadows of age, rather than dimming her, became her last illumination. For in them she discovered what she had always known, but only now could fully live. That the truest light is not seen but felt, and that it shines most gently when everything else grows quiet. When the body begins to slow and the voice grows faint, what remains of a life once lived so publicly? For Helen Keller, legacy was never something to be planned or secured. It was something that flowed outward naturally, like water finding its way through the smallest cracks of stone. She had never thought of herself as a monument, nor wished to become one. The thought of being remembered as a symbol rather than as a living, flawed, searching human being would have embarrassed her. And yet, by the time she entered her 8th decade, her influence had already outgrown her presence. Her name had become a kind of shorthand for endurance and grace. Her image appeared in school books, in hospital corridors, in the speeches of politicians and preachers alike. But Helen herself moved gently beneath the weight of all that reverence, untouched by it, as though she had already stepped aside to let her work continue without her. "What endures," she once wrote, "is not what we do, but what we awaken in others." Her daily life had settled into a rhythm of quiet observation. The world outside her window pulsed with change, civil rights marches, scientific breakthroughs, new conflicts, and new hopes. And though she could no longer participate directly, she felt each tremor of history as if it passed through her very skin. Visitors often brought her news of the times, spelling out events and names that seemed impossibly distant from the child who had once struggled to understand a single word. Yet she did not feel separated from the age. Rather, she felt that the arc of her life had joined invisibly with the currents moving through humanity. The causes she had once championed, the education of the blind, the rights of women, the dignity of labor, had become institutions, movements, ideas no longer bound to her name. She took comfort in that. "The proof of love," she wrote, is that it no longer needs to be recognized as love. The American Foundation for the Blind, where she had long served as ambassador and advocate, became the vessel for her legacy in motion. Through its programs, thousands of men, women, and children gained access to books, training, and employment. Helen followed its progress through reports and letters, tracing with her fingers the embossed statistics, not for pride, but for reassurance that the work still breathed. She met often with the young representatives of these new generations, students, teachers, researchers, who came to thank her. To each she would say, "Do not thank me. The road was here before me, and it will continue after you." Her humility was neither feigned nor philosophical. It came from a genuine awareness that no life, however great, stands alone. Polly Thompson continued to manage her affairs with disciplined affection, though she too had begun to falter with age. Her eyesight dimmed, her hands stiffened, but her devotion to Helen never waned. Together, the two women had formed a partnership that was less fiery than Helen's early bond with Anne, but no less profound. They moved through their days like two notes of the same melody, sustaining one another in perfect balance. When Polly grew ill, Helen insisted on sitting by her bedside, feeling her pulse, tracing her hand as if reading the story of their years together. "You have carried me," she told her softly. "Now I will carry you." In those words, the roles of giver and receiver dissolved, revealing the truth that love in its purest form has no direction. It flows both ways, endlessly. After Polly's death, Helen was briefly overcome by a familiar solitude. Yet unlike the grief she had known after Anne's passing, this sorrow was quieter, more like a tide that ebbs but never truly leaves. By now she had learned that those who love us do not depart. They simply move into the space of our memory from where they continue to speak. And so, she continued her days with the calm dignity that had become her signature, guided by the faint but unbroken echo of the hands that had shaped her life. As her public appearances ceased altogether, she began to receive honors from around the world, medals, honorary degrees, tributes from governments and universities. They arrived in ornate envelopes or polished cases, and Polly's successors would describe them in detail before placing them in drawers. Helen appreciated the gestures, but regarded them with gentle detachment. "Each award," she said, "is a reminder of how far we still must go." The titles and ceremonies meant little compared to the knowledge that a blind child somewhere was learning to read for the first time, that a deaf woman had found her voice, that a community had been transformed by compassion. Those, she believed, were the true emblems of her work, the unseen recognitions that mattered most. The younger generations who visited her often came expecting to meet a figure carved from history, but they found instead a woman still very much alive, still capable of laughter, still quick to inquire about their own hopes. She took joy in the small details of others' lives, the sound of their children's names spelled into her hand, the warmth of a handshake, the promise of ideas she would never see fulfilled. Her curiosity never dulled. "Tell me," she would sign, "what do people dream of now?" When told about rockets that could reach beyond the clouds, about machines that could record and replay sound, she smiled and said, "Then perhaps one day they will learn to listen to the stars." She saw in progress not a triumph, but a question, a moral challenge that technology alone could not answer. Her home became quieter still, the pace of life slowing into something almost sacred. She no longer dictated daily. Instead, she would sit for long hours with her hands folded, her breathing even, her face serene. Those who saw her at these times often described her as if she were in prayer, though it was not prayer in any formal sense. It was communion, an unspoken dialogue with the vastness she had spent her life learning to feel. She said once, "I do not speak to God, I listen, and in listening, I understand that I am already heard." Her mind, even as her strength waned, remained luminous. She continued to think deeply about the legacy of perception, the ways in which humanity understood or failed to understand its own nature. She believed that blindness, both literal and figurative, would always exist, but that it need not mean darkness. "The greatest revolution," she wrote in one of her last essays, "will come when men learn that vision begins in compassion." Those words would later appear engraved on the walls of schools and foundations, though at the time she wrote them, she thought of them only as a simple truth to leave behind, like a note placed under a stone for someone else to find. As her world grew smaller, her influence continued to ripple outward. The organizations she had inspired expanded their reach across continents. Films were made about her life, books translated into dozens of languages, plays performed that carried her story to those who had never known her name before. Helen herself took little interest in these portrayals. When told of a new adaptation of her childhood, she smiled and said, "If they see only the miracle, they will have missed the meaning." The miracle was never that I learned words, but that I learned to listen. The seasons passed gently in those final years. She would sit in her garden during spring, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, her hands brushing the petals of roses. Each flower seemed to her a fragment of eternity, a brief embodiment of beauty's persistence. "Everything blooms again," she said once, "even memory." Her words, simple and tender, carried the fullness of her understanding, that the legacy of a life is not measured in monuments but in renewal, in the ways love continues to take form long after the body rests. When evening came and the garden grew still, she would linger outside as long as the air remained soft, her hand resting on the arm of whoever accompanied her. The sky, unseen, stretched endlessly above, and she imagined its darkness not as emptiness, but as promise. "Perhaps," she whispered one night, "the stars are simply the light we leave behind." And in that thought, everything she had ever believed found its quiet completion. The certainty that no act of kindness, no moment of understanding, no flicker of compassion ever truly disappears. It moves forward endlessly, carried in unseen hands, passed from soul to soul, like light traveling through darkness, without ever fading. The last years of Helen Keller's life unfolded in the slow, golden quiet of a candle burning low, its light gentle, yet unwavering. Time had softened her, not by eroding her will, but by deepening her acceptance of the world's impermanence. The once restless traveler who had crossed oceans and continents now moved only within the small boundaries of her home. Yet within that space, she seemed to inhabit an infinity. She no longer sought to teach or to argue or to persuade. Her life itself had become the lesson. Visitors still came, reverent and hesitant, as though entering a sanctuary. They would find her seated in her favorite chair, her posture upright despite the frailty of age, her face turned slightly toward the window. Her hands, once the conduits of endless words, now rested folded in her lap, motionless except for the subtle rhythm of her breath. When they greeted her, she would smile, take their hand gently, and nod, as if she already knew all that needed to be said. Her days were filled with the smallest gestures, each one imbued with quiet grace. Morning sunlight on her skin, the soft vibration of a bird landing on the window ledge, the gentle touch of a caregiver guiding her through the hall. These were the languages she now spoke. Her hearing and sight had been gone for more than 70 years, yet those who spent time with her often remarked that she seemed to perceive more than anyone else in the room. It was as though her understanding had transcended the boundaries of sense entirely. Even silence had texture for her, and stillness held its own form of communication. "Everything," she once said, "still speaks." In the early months of 1968, she fell ill, her body weakened by years of labor and the natural decline of age. She spent more time in bed, sleeping often, her energy receding like a tide returning to the sea. Yet when she was awake, her mind remained lucid, her touch still tender. Nurses read letters to her through sign language, and she listened with the same attentiveness she had given to the great thinkers and poets of her youth. Friends visited to bid her farewell, though none dared to speak of death directly. Helen herself treated it with calm humor, saying, "I am not leaving, I am arriving." She had long believed that life and death were not opposites, but stages of the same journey, as inseparable as darkness and light. To her, death was not an end, but a widening, a final act of perception. Polly had been gone for years by then, as had Anne, and though their absences might have left another soul hollow, Helen felt their presence as vividly as ever. She often said she could feel Anne's guidance when her thoughts grew clouded, and Polly's steady touch when the pain in her hands returned. "They are near," she would sigh softly, just beyond the curtain. It comforted her to imagine that the line between life and death was not a barrier, but a veil, thin and trembling, waiting to be lifted. Her faith was not born of doctrine, but of experience, of knowing that the unseen could be more real than the visible. As her health declined, her attendants began to read to her from her own writings, as though her past self could accompany her into rest. Passages from the story of my life, from her essays on love and understanding, from her reflections on darkness and grace, all were spelled into her hand as she lay quietly, her expression serene. Sometimes she would smile faintly and murmur, "Yes, I remember." Other times she would shake her head slightly, as if surprised by her own words, whispering, "Did I truly say that?" The words had outlived their author, yet in those final weeks they returned to her as companions, familiar, tender, and forgiving. Outside her window, spring had come again. The garden was in bloom, and the scent of lilac drifted into her room. Her caregivers opened the window wide so that the breeze might touch her face. She seemed to draw strength from it, as though the world itself were breathing for her. "The air feels full of beginnings," she signed one morning. "Perhaps there are no endings at all." That afternoon she slept for a long time, her breathing slow and steady, her hands resting open on the blanket as if an invitation. When she woke, she asked for the window to be opened again. The nurse obliged, and for a moment Helen simply lay there, her head turned toward the light she could not see. "It is warm," she whispered, and then smiled, her expression one of pure peace. The next morning, June 1st, she did not wake. She passed from sleep into silence as gently as a sigh. There was no struggle, no suddenness, only the soft release of breath, like a door opening quietly into another room. Those who stood by her bedside said that her face seemed almost illuminated, that her final expression carried the same serenity that had marked her life. It was as if she had simply followed the current she had always trusted, the one that had carried her from darkness into language, from silence into meaning, from flesh into memory. News of her death spread quickly across the world. Tributes poured in from every continent, from presidents and poets, from school children and scholars. Obituaries called her a symbol of the indomitable human spirit, the voice of the unseen, the heart that heard beyond hearing. But among the many words written about her, one sentiment returned again and again, that she had taught humanity not what it means to see, but what it means to perceive. Her funeral was simple, as she had wished. There were no grand speeches, no fanfare, only a few close friends, a handful of roses, and the soft murmur of wind through the trees. Her ashes were placed beside those of Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson, the two women whose hands had carried her through every threshold. In the days that followed, people spoke of her not with grief but with reverence, as though her passing had confirmed rather than diminished her presence. Teachers read her words aloud in classrooms. Blind students touched her name in Braille for the first time, tracing the legacy she had left them. Her story, so often retold, reinterpreted, simplified, seemed, in that moment, to return to its essence, the story of a human soul discovering connection in a world that believed her cut off from it. She had shown that understanding is not born of sight or sound, but of openness, the courage to reach out, to feel, to listen in ways that defy the senses. In that final silence, Helen Keller had not vanished. She had simply joined the larger conversation she had always sensed, pulsing beneath the world's noise, the conversation of wind and water, of memory and love, of all the lives she had touched. And somewhere, in the rhythm of that silence, one might still imagine her hand moving gently through the air, spelling the words that had once opened her to everything: water, light, love, and finally, the unspoken word that unites them all. After her passing, the world did not fall silent. It seemed instead to begin listening differently. The name Helen Keller no longer belonged only to the woman who had lived, written, and traveled. It became a living idea, a quiet force that moved through generations, through classrooms and libraries, through the fragile hearts of those seeking meaning in adversity. Her life had crossed the threshold from biography into something larger, something that breathed not in memory alone, but in the daily acts of courage. Her story continued to inspire. People spoke of her not merely as a figure from history, but as a presence, a voice still murmuring beneath the surface of things. In hospitals where the blind learned to read, in schools for the deaf where children first traced the shapes of words, in homes where loneliness felt insurmountable, her example lingered like a hand extended through the dark. The silence that had defined her early years had become her final gift to humanity, a reminder that silence itself can teach us how to hear. In the years that followed her death, her words found new homes in unexpected places. Passages from her essays were engraved into stone, printed on walls, recited at commencements, and whispered to children who feared their own limitations. They were carried into space on recordings of human speech, as though her voice, translated and softened by others, might speak for the entire species. Each retelling, each adaptation, reshaped her a little. Yet something essential always remained: the gentleness, the courage, the unwavering belief that knowledge without compassion is empty. Her life had never been about overcoming blindness, but about transforming it, about proving that darkness, too, can be a medium for vision. "I have been blind but not sightless," she once wrote, and in that paradox her entire legacy lived. Historians and writers tried to define her influence, to map its boundaries, but her impact could not be contained by categories of disability, activism, or philosophy. She had spoken to the human condition itself, to the longing of every soul to be understood beyond words. In an age increasingly consumed by noise and speed, her example stood like a quiet mirror, asking what it meant to truly perceive. "The highest form of intelligence," she had once written, "is not reason but empathy." Those words, once dismissed as sentiment, grew more prophetic with time. Long after her death, movements for human rights, education, and peace would draw upon her vision. The organizations she had helped build expanded their reach across continents, teaching not only literacy, but dignity. For those who labored unseen, her memory became a form of recognition, a proof that the unseen can shape the visible world. Yet the true continuation of her life was not in institutions or monuments, but in individuals. A young girl in Cairo learned to read Braille by tracing the letters of Helen's name. A deaf student in Tokyo kept her photograph above his desk as a promise that silence was not emptiness. A soldier who had lost his sight during war found in her story the strength to live again. These were not grand testaments, but small, luminous echoes of her existence, multiplying quietly across time. She had once said that she hoped to leave behind not admiration but awakening, and she had succeeded. Her story became a kind of moral vibration, moving unseen through the centuries, reminding people that perception begins not in the eyes, but in the heart. Scholars revisited her writings and found depths they had previously overlooked. Beneath the polished public image of the saintly Helen Keller lay a thinker of profound subtlety, a woman who had wrestled with questions of justice, philosophy, and the limits of human understanding. Her radicalism, long softened by polite retellings, began to reemerge. Historians uncovered her early socialist essays, her anti-war speeches, her unwavering defense of equality. The world, it seemed, had needed decades to catch up with her clarity. What some had once called naivety, later generations recognized as foresight. Her insistence that love was a political force, that compassion was a form of truth, began to sound less idealistic and more necessary. The heart, she had written, is the only instrument wide enough for the music of the world. Those who studied her anew began to see her not as a saint, apart from history, but as a participant in its most urgent struggles. Her home, preserved as a museum, became a place of pilgrimage. Visitors walked the paths she once took, stood by the water pump that had given her language, and felt, for a brief moment, the current of wonder that had flowed through her life. Children placed their hands upon the cool metal handle, imitating the gesture that had awakened her mind more than a century earlier. Teachers told them how a single word, water, had opened a universe. Yet even as they spoke, something deeper stirred in that small act of imitation. The recognition that every human being, in some way, is still standing before that pump, waiting for understanding to flow through their hands. Over time, the myth of Helen Keller, crafted by films, books, and retellings, grew distant from the complexity of the woman herself. The world loved her purity, her triumph, her light, but often forgot her fire. Yet perhaps that too was part of her endurance. She had once said that truth must be translated to be understood, and in every generation she was translated anew. Whether remembered as a saint of perseverance or a prophet of empathy, she continued to provoke reflection. Her silence was never empty. It was an invitation. And those who listened carefully enough could still feel within it the pulse of her question. What does it mean to truly see? In the decades after her death, scientists made breakthroughs in communication, new technologies allowing the blind to read with light, the deaf to hear through vibration, the mute to speak through machines. Each advance seemed to echo something she had long ago intuited, that the boundaries of the senses are temporary, and that human ingenuity, guided by compassion, can bridge even the deepest silence. Had she lived to witness it, she would not have claimed credit. She would have smiled, touched the machines gently, and said, "This too is touch." For her, every act of connection, no matter how mechanical, was part of the same divine continuum, the ongoing effort of the human spirit to reach beyond itself. The water pump in Tuscumbia still stands, weathered by time but unbroken. Visitors describe it as unremarkable, a simple relic of iron and stone, but to those who know the story, it remains a sacred object. For it was there that the barrier between isolation and communion first cracked open, releasing a current that would ripple across history. Each year, on the anniversary of Helen's birth, flowers are placed at its base, their scent rising softly in the southern air. And in that quiet garden, if one listens with patience, there is a kind of answering stillness, as though the earth itself remembers. Perhaps the sound of water running through unseen pipes is just the world breathing her memory, a reminder that enlightenment often begins in silence, with a single hand reaching toward another. Helen Keller's name became more than a symbol of perseverance. It became a language for hope itself. To say her name was to invoke the idea that all human limitation is temporary, that understanding is always possible. She had once written, The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. In the century that followed, those words were repeated endlessly, sometimes reduced to sentiment, sometimes rediscovered as truth. Yet no matter how they were used, they endured, as she had. They lingered not because of their poetry, but because they carried the quiet authority of a life lived in their service. And so, long after her death, the echo of her presence continued to move through the world, subtle as breath, steady as light filtered through water. She had begun in silence and ended in it, but the space between had become an ocean of connection. Her voice, unheard yet undeniable, continued to remind humanity that the soul does not need eyes to see nor ears to understand. It needs only love, patient and enduring, to recognize itself in another. Time, indifferent yet merciful, carried the world further from the years of Helen Keller's life, but not from her presence. Her story lingered like the quiet after a hymn, not ending, only expanding. Each generation found its own reflection in her, reshaping her meaning, rediscovering her courage. In classrooms, her name was spoken in tones of reverence. In libraries, her words were traced by hands that could not see but understood deeply. In hospitals, her example offered a form of medicine that no science could bottle, the belief that darkness, however complete, could still be a place of birth. It was as if the silence she had inhabited had become a universal space, a shared room within the human spirit where all could enter to listen. That was her true monument, invisible yet enduring, the conversation that began the moment she learned to speak and that has never stopped. For Helen, death had never been a conclusion. She'd often said that her soul belonged to the continuity of things, to the pulse that moves through trees and rivers, through breath and thought. And in the decades after her passing, it seemed as though the world confirmed her faith. The institutions she helped shape, the American Foundation for the Blind, the Perkins Institute, countless schools and organizations, grew into a global network of light, teaching not only reading and writing, but also resilience and dignity. Her image, captured in photographs and films, remained calm, her face turned slightly upward as if listening to something beyond the human range. She had lived her life as an act of listening, and the world, finally, was learning to listen back. Writers who revisited her work found layers of meaning that earlier audiences had missed. They read her essays not as sentimental relics, but as philosophical meditations on perception, consciousness, and empathy. Her reflections on language, touch, and faith began to influence psychologists, poets, and theologians alike. Scholars noted how her thoughts anticipated later understandings of sensory perception, how her insistence on interconnectedness foreshadowed ecological and spiritual movements yet to come. She had been called many things in her lifetime: miracle, saint, reformer. But beneath all these titles was something simpler and more profound. She was a philosopher of the invisible. Her life itself had been her argument, her existence a quiet refutation of the limits others believed in. As the century turned and technology reshaped the fabric of communication, Helen's voice, long mediated by interpreters, found new ways to be heard. Recordings of her speech, preserved in fragile archives, were restored, her halting words digitized and sent across the globe. For many listeners, hearing her speak for the first time was a revelation. The voice was rough, uncertain, shaped by years of silence, but within its texture lay something luminous, something unmistakably human. It reminded people that communication is not perfection of sound, but presence of intent. Her voice was proof that meaning does not depend on clarity, it depends on courage. Artists, too, returned to her, drawn by the poetic contradiction of her life. A woman without sight who illuminated the world, without hearing yet known by her voice. Painters, composers, and filmmakers reimagined her journey, each one seeking to touch that delicate line between isolation and communion that had defined her existence. Yet what they discovered, again and again, was that her story resisted dramatization. It was not a tragedy, not a triumph. It was a meditation. To tell it was to approach mystery, the mystery of perception itself. For what Helen taught, more than any doctrine or slogan, was that perception is an act of love. In the quiet spaces where her name is still spoken, that lesson continues. A teacher in a small village guides a blind child's fingers across a page of Braille, whispering Helen's story. A doctor in a rehabilitation center in Nairobi cites her work as proof that the human mind adapts endlessly. A poet in Kyoto quotes her reflection that, "To feel the earth beneath one's feet is to touch eternity." Each moment is a continuation of her work, not in grand gestures, but in the steady hum of compassion, the simple faith that no life is beyond connection. Somewhere in Alabama, the old water pump remains, its iron surface smooth from decades of touch. Children still visit it, pressing their hands against the cool metal, reenacting that miraculous moment when the word water bridged the abyss between silence and speech. The guides tell them how a young girl, blind and deaf, first understood language there. But what they cannot tell them is how that single revelation became a current that carried across time. The pump stands as both artifact and metaphor, a reminder that meaning, once discovered, does not vanish. It flows on, feeding roots unseen. If one listens closely, one might imagine the faint trickle of water still running beneath the earth, whispering the lesson of that day. That understanding, once born, never dries. In many ways, the world she left behind has grown noisier, brighter, more restless. People speak faster, see more, and understand less. Yet in moments of crisis or quiet despair, her words resurface like light under deep water. Although the world is full of suffering, she had written, it is also full of the overcoming of it. Those words have outlived wars and revolutions. They have comforted the grieving, emboldened the weary, and reminded the arrogant that resilience is the truest intelligence. They endure because they come not from theory, but from experience, from a woman who had lived where others only imagined, inside the boundless dark that surrounds every human soul. It is tempting to see Helen Keller as a figure frozen in history, a relic of inspiration. But the deeper truth is that she remains present, her influence woven into the quiet fabric of empathy that sustains the human world. Every time one person reaches out to another, every time patience replaces judgment, every time love triumphs over fear, the conversation she began continues. Her life was never about her own triumph. It was about teaching humanity to recognize itself. She showed that blindness is not the absence of sight, but the refusal to see beyond oneself, and that true hearing is not of sound, but of understanding. And so, long after her body returned to dust, her presence endures, not in marble or in memory alone, but in the invisible exchange that binds people to one another. It lives in the touch of a teacher's hand guiding a student's, in the silent gratitude between strangers, in the calm recognition that even darkness can be full of light. The conversation she began, the one between silence and speech, between isolation and communion, goes on, infinite as water, gentle as light. Perhaps that is how she would have wished to be remembered, not as a saint or a miracle, but as a voice that continues to ask the most human of questions. Can we truly see each other? And perhaps, if one sits quietly enough, the answer will come, not as a sound, but as a feeling, the unmistakable touch of understanding, the eternal conversation that has never stopped since a young girl's hand met the flow of water and the world opened its eyes,